Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to go to sleep. So first like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Make yourself comfortable and relax. I never thought I would be afraid of my own shadow. But that was before it moved in next door. Now every flicker of movement, every unexpected sound makes my heart race. It started innocently enough, but isn't that how these things always begin? The day Jake moved in was unremarkable. I was watering the plants on my porch when a moving truck pulled up to the house next door. It had been vacant for months, so I was curious to see who my new neighbor would be. That's when I first saw him, tall with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He noticed me watching and waved. I waved back, thinking how nice it would be to have someone new in the neighborhood. If only I'd known then what I know now. At first Jake seemed friendly enough. He'd wave when he saw me outside, and we'd exchange pleasantries about the weather or the local gossip. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way his eyes would linger a little too long, or how he always seemed to. I started noticing him more and more. When I left for work in the morning, he was there checking his mailbox or watering his lawn. When I came home in the evening, he was outside, as if waiting for me. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a coincidence. After all, neighbors see each other all the time, right? I'd be sitting on my couch reading a book, and I'd get this tingling sensation on the back of my neck. And I'd look up, and I'd see a shadow moving away from the window next door. And once I could have sworn I'd see the curtain fall back into place, as if someone had just been standing there looking. And I started keeping my curtains closed all the time. But it didn't help. The feeling of being watched only intensified. I'd wake up into the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure that I'd heard footsteps outside my bedroom window. But when I'd look, there was never anyone there. Then the notes started appearing. The first one I found tucked under my windshield wiper. "You look beautiful when you sleep," it read in neat block letters. I felt my stomach drop, my hand shaking as I read it again and again. I told myself it must be a mistake, that it wasn't meant for me. But deep down I knew better. I started parking my car in the garage after that, but it didn't stop. The notes, they'd appear on my porch, slipped under my front door, even in my mailbox, each one more unsettling than the last. "I love watching you make coffee in the morning. That red dress looks amazing on you. Why did you close your curtains? Don't you want me to see you?" I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do. The notes weren't explicitly threatening, and I had no proof of who was sending them. They suggested I install security cameras, which I did, but it didn't help. Whoever was leaving the notes knew where the cameras were and avoided them. I knew it had to be Jake. Who else could it be? But I had no proof, and he was always so friendly. When I saw him, he'd ask how I was doing, if I was sleeping okay. "You look tired," he'd say, concern in his voice. "Is everything all right?" It was like he was taunting me, letting me know he could see how this was affecting me. I started changing my routine, leaving for work at different times, taking different routes home. But somehow, he always seemed to know where I was. I'd see his car parked on the street when I went grocery shopping, or I'd spot him at the same coffee shop I ducked into to avoid going home. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're so peaceful when you sleep." I bolted upright, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I looked at my window, sure I'd see Jake's face pressed against the glass, but there was nothing there. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my sister, sobbing, and told her everything. She insisted I come stay with her for a while, and I agreed. I packed a bag, my hand shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. As I was loading my car, Jake came out of his house, going somewhere. He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes intense. "Just visiting my sister for a few days." I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, smiling. Have a safe trip. I'll keep an eye on your place while you're gone. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I got in my car and drove away, watching him in my rearview mirror. He stood there watching me go until I turned the corner and lost sight of him. I stayed with my sister for a week, sleeping better than I had in months. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. I had to go back, had to face this. I couldn't let him win. When I returned home, everything seemed normal. There were no new notes, no signs that anyone had been in my house for a few days. I allowed myself to hope that maybe it was over, that Jake had moved on, or realized he'd gone too far. But then one evening, as I was making dinner, I heard a noise from my basement. It was faint, just a soft thud, but in the quiet of my house, it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze. The knife I'd been using to chop vegetables clutched in my hand. I stood there, barely breathing, straining to hear any other sound for a long moment. There was nothing. Then I heard it again, a creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. My mind raced. Should I call the police? But what if it was nothing? What if I was just paranoid? I'd look ridiculous if cops showed up and found nothing but a scared woman and an empty basement. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I had to know. I couldn't live like this anymore, jumping at every sound. A raid in my own home with a knife still in my hand. I slowly made my way to the basement door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I paused, listening. Again, silence. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling. But I had to be sure. I opened the door, flicking on the light switch. The bare bulb flickered to life, casting hard shadows across the cluttered space. Everything looked normal. Boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture covered in sheets, the washing machine in the corner. I took a step down, then another. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I winced at the sound. I reached the bottom, my eyes darting around, looking for anything out of place. That's when I saw it, a door I'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. My breath caught in my throat. How had I never seen this before? I lived in this house for years, and I'd never known there was another room down here. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone in the house could hear it. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. With trembling fingers, I reached out and pushed it open. The hinges groaned, the sound echoing in the stillness of the basement. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out shapes, a chair, a table, and something on the walls. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the space, and I felt my blood run cold. The walls were covered in photos, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and they were all of me leaving for work, me getting the mail, me sitting on my couch reading, me sleeping in my bed. Intimate moments I thought were private, all captured and displayed like some twisted art gallery. In the center of the room was a table covered in stacks of paper. I moved closer, my legs feeling like lead. They were printouts of text messages, emails, browser histories, all mine. Every aspect of my digital life laid out for someone else to see. And there in the middle of it all was a notebook. I picked it up with shaking hands, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was familiar, the same neat block letters from the notes. Day 1, she moved in today. She's perfect. I've been waiting so long for someone like her. I flipped through the pages, my horror growing with each one. It detailed everything, my daily routines, my conversations, my habits, things I did when I thought I was alone, private moments I never imagined anyone else would know about. The last entry was from that morning. She's back. I knew she'd come back to me tonight. We'll finally be together. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. And there he was, Jake, standing in the doorway, a smile on his face and a glint in his eye that made my blood run cold. Welcome home, he said softly. I've been waiting for you. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in a sea of darkness. I'd driven the stretch of Highway 100 times, but never had it felt so desolate, so threatening. And as I sat there, the silence pressing it around me, I realized how vulnerable I truly was. That's when I saw the headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. I'd been driving for hours, making my way back from a business trip that had dragged on far too long. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of my tires on asphalt and the occasional flicker of my headlights catching a road sign. I was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that makes your eyelids heavy and your mind fuzzy. I should have stopped at that last gas station, topped up the tank, and grabbed a coffee, but I was eager to get home to crawl into my own bed and forget about spreadsheets and presentations for a while, so I pushed on, ignoring the gas gauge as it dipped lower and lower. When the engine first started to sputter, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a hiccup, maybe some bad gas, but deep down I knew I'd pushed my luck too far, and now I was paying the price. The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder, the headlights cutting a small swath of visibility in the inky blackness. I sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, as if by sheer force of will I could make the car start again. No such luck. I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness. No signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and empty fields. Help felt a million miles away. That's when I saw them headlights in the distance growing larger. As they approached, relief washed over me. Another car meant another person, someone who could help, or at least call for a tow truck. When they reached an area with cell service, I stepped out of my car, waving my arms to flag down the approaching vehicle. The headlights slowed, and I felt a smile spread across my face. Maybe my luck was turning around after all. The car, an old pickup truck that had seen better days, pulled up behind me and came to a stop. The headlights stayed on, leaving me squinting into the glare as a figure emerged from the driver's side. Car trouble, a man's voice called out. Friendly enough, yeah, I replied, shielding my eyes with one hand. I think I ran out of gas. Don't suppose you have a spare can with you? The man chuckled, a low sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. As he stepped into the space between our vehicles, I could finally make out his features. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. No gas, I'm afraid, he said, coming closer. But I've got some tools in the truck. Maybe we can take a look, see if it's something else. I hesitated. Something about the way he moved, the way his eyes never quite met mine, set off a warning bell in the back of my mind. But what choice did I have? I was stuck here alone with no way to call for help. That would be great, thanks, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and turned back to his truck. As he rummaged around in the bed, I took the opportunity to study him more closely. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been working outside all day. There was a stain on his shirt that looked darker than dirt, but in the poor light, I couldn't be sure. When he turned back to me, he was holding a flashlight and a toolbox. Let's take a look under the hood, he said, moving towards my car. I popped the hood and stepped back, watching as he leaned and shining the flashlight over the engine. He muttered to himself as he worked words I couldn't quite make out. So he said, suddenly, not looking up from the engine, what brings you out here so late? Just heading home from a business trip, I replied, trying to sound casual. Guess I miscalculated how much gas I had left, he grunted in response, then straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. Well, it's not the battery, he said, and I don't see any obvious leaks. Probably is just out of gas. I nodded, unsure of what to say next. To the man stood there, looking at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Where you headed? He asked, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp. Just up to Cedar Grove, I said, naming a town about an hour up the road. It wasn't where I was actually going, but something told me not to give this stranger too much information. He nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Cedar Grove, huh? That's quite a ways from here. You got family there? I shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of how alone we were on this dark stretch of road. No, just home, I said, trying to keep my voice light. Listen, I really appreciate you stopping, but maybe I should just call for a tow truck. The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. No cell service out here, he said, gesturing to the empty road around us. Nearest town's about 20 mil. The way he pointed down the road in the direction I'd been heading, my heart sank. 20 mil, it might as well have been 100. Tell you what, the man continued, closing my car's hood with a thud that made me jump. I can give you a ride to town. There's a gas station there. We can get you some gas and bring it back here. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say no. This man, this situation, it all felt wrong. But what other choice did I have? I couldn't stay here all night, and walking 20 m in the dark wasn't an option. I don't want to put you out, I stammered, buying time as I tried to think of a way out of this. The man waved his hand dismissively. No trouble at all, he said. I'm headed that way anyhow. Wouldn't feel right leaving you out here all alone. Never know what kind of folks might come along. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. I forced a smile, my mind racing. That's really kind of you, I said, but maybe I should just wait here. My boyfriend is expecting me. He'll probably come looking for me when I don't show up. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and I saw something flash across his face. Anger, disappointment. It was gone so quickly. I couldn't be sure. Boyfriend, huh? He said, his tone suddenly cooler. Funny, I didn't see a ring on your finger. Most guys would have put one there by now if they cared about you. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had he noticed my hands? I hadn't even shaken hands with him. We're not really the marrying type, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Listen, I think I'll just wait here, but thank you for stopping. The man took a step closer, and I had to fight the urge to back away. Now don't be like that, he said, his voice low. I'm just trying to help. It's not safe out here for a pretty little thing like you. All sorts of bad people around. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of an engine. We both turned to look down the road. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger as they approached. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Another car meant another person, maybe someone who could help me get out of this situation. Man's demeanor changed instantly. He stepped back, his face once again a mask of friendly concern. Well, would you look at that, he said, his voice jovial. Looks like your luck's changing already. The approaching vehicle, a semi-truck, slowed as it neared us. The driver must have seen my car on the side of the road. As it pulled to a stop, I saw the man from the pickup, tense, his eyes darting between me and the truck. Everything okay here? A new voice called out as the truck driver climbed down from his cab. Just a little car trouble, I called back, relief evident in my voice. I ran out of gas. The truck driver, a burly man with a kind face, nodded. I've got a spare can in the truck, he said. Let me grab it for you. As he turned back to his vehicle, I saw the man from the pickup take a step towards his own car. Well, he said, his voice tight, it looks like you're in good hands now. I'll be on my way. Before I could respond, he was in his truck, the engine roaring to life. He pulled away quickly, tires squealing slightly on the asphalt as he disappeared into the night. I felt the tension drain from my body. The truck driver returned with a gas can, and as he helped me fill up my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I'd come to something. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew it wouldn't have been good. As I finally pulled back onto the road, my hands still shaking slightly on the steering wheel, I made a promise to myself: no more pushing my luck, no more ignoring my instincts, and definitely no more running out of gas on dark, lonely highways, because sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed or in the shadows. Sometimes they're right there in plain sight, offering you a helping hand and a friendly smile the moment I stepped into that dimly lit hallway, I knew something was off. The air felt heavy, pregnant with an unspoken threat. But by the time I realized the danger, it was already too late. The door clicked shut behind me, and I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I never thought much about the risks of my job as a food delivery driver. Sure, there were the occasional rude customers or confusing apartment complexes, but nothing truly dangerous. It was just a way to make some extra cash while I finished up my degree. But that night changed everything. It started like any other shift. I picked up an order from a local pizza joint, a large pepperoni and a 2L of soda. Nothing unusual. The delivery address was for an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. I'd never been there before, but that wasn't uncommon. Our delivery radius was pretty wide. As I drove, the streets became less familiar. The well-lit main roads gave way to darker, narrower streets. Houses became sparse, replaced by overgrown lots and the occasional dilapidated building. I checked my GPS again. Sure, I must have taken a wrong turn, but no, this was the right way. Finally, I saw it looming in the distance, a massive, imposing apartment building that looked like it had seen better days. The brick facade was stained and crumbling in places, and half the windows were dark. It didn't look like the kind of place that would be ordering delivery at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. I parked my car in the nearly empty lot, grabbing the pizza and drink. As I approached the main entrance, I noticed the security door was propped open with a brick that should have been my first warning sign. But I was too focused on finishing the delivery and moving on to my next order. The lobby was dimly lit with flickering fluorescent lights that cast eerie shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The elevator looked like it hadn't worked in years, so I headed for the stairs. The order was for apartment 4C. As I climbed, the stairwell grew darker. By the time I reached the fourth floor, I had to use my phone's flashlight to see where I was going. The hallway was no better. Only every third light seemed to be working, leaving large patches of darkness between pools of sickly yellow light. I made my way down the hall, the numbers on the doors counting up for a 4B. I stopped in front of 4C, my hand raised to knock. That's when I noticed the door was slightly ajar. "Hello," I called out, pushing the door open a bit more. Pizza delivery, no response, just silence. I should have left right, then should have set the pizza down, marked the order as delivered, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. Maybe it was the promise of a tip, or maybe just my own stupid curiosity. Whatever the reason, I took a step inside. "Hello, is anyone home? I've got your pizza order here." The apartment was dark save for the pale glow of a TV in what I assumed was the living room. I took another step, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. That's when I heard it, the soft click of the door closing behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the door. How had I not seen them? Sorry, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just delivering the pizza you ordered." The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there blocking my exit. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back. "Look, I can just leave the pizza here and go, no charge." "Okay." Finally the figure spoke. It was a man's voice, low and grave. "Why don't you come in and set it down? I'm sure you could use a break." Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but where he was blocking the only exit I knew of, I clutched the pizza box tighter, as if it could somehow protect me. "That's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "I've got other deliveries to make. I'll just leave this here." I set the pizza and soda down on a small table near the door, then turned back to the man. "If you could just move aside, I'll be on my way." He chuckled, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "But you've only just arrived. Why don't you stay a while?" He took a step towards me, and I instinctively backed up. My foot caught on something, a rug maybe, and I stumbled, catching myself on the wall. As I did, my hand brushed against a light switch. Without thinking, I flipped it on. The sudden flood of light momentarily blinded me, As my eyes adjusted, I got my first clear look at the man, and the apartment behind him. He was older than I expected, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were dirty and worn, hanging loose on his thin frame, but it was his eyes that caught my attention, cold and calculating, with a glint of something I couldn't quite place, something dangerous behind him. The apartment was a mess. Piles of newspapers and empty food containers littered every surface. The walls were covered in what looked like newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. But what made my blood run cold were the photos. Dozens, maybe hundreds of photos were tacked to the walls, and they were all of me getting into my car, me delivering pizzas to other addresses, me walking into my apartment building. Some were clearly taken with a long-range lens, while others looked like they had been snapped from just a few feet away. What the hell is this? I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've been waiting for you for a long time, Alex. He knew my name, of course. He did. He'd been watching me, stalking me, for who knows how long, why. I couldn't form a coherent thought. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I was seeing. He took another step towards me. You're special, Alex. I knew it from the moment I first saw you. Were meant to be together. I felt bile rise in my throat. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of nightmare. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I don't know who you are or what you want, but this isn't okay. I'm leaving now, and I'm calling the police. I reached for my phone, but before I could grab it, he lunged at me, his hand clamped around my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for such a thin man. You're not going anywhere, he growled, all pretense of friendliness gone from his voice. I reacted on instinct, bringing my knee up hard between his legs. He let out a grunt of pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I shoved him as hard as I could, sending him stumbling back into a pile of newspapers. I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached for the handle, I realized with horror that it was locked. Not just locked, there was a deadbolt that required a key from both sides. No, I muttered frantically, trying to turn the lock behind me. I could hear him getting to his feet, cursing under his breath. I sped around, looking for another way out. The windows were barred. I had noticed that when I came in, but hadn't thought much of it. Now those bars looked like the gates of a prison. He was on his feet now, advancing towards me with a look of fury on his face. You shouldn't have done that, Alex, he snarled. We could have done this the easy way. I backed up until I hit the wall, my eyes darting around for anything I could use as a weapon. My gaze fell on the 2L bottle of soda I had brought with the pizza. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it at him with all my strength. The bottle caught him square in the face, sending him reeling back. I heard a crunch as his nose broke, blood immediately starting to pour down his face. He howled in pain and anger, giving me the opening I needed. I bolted past him deeper into the apartment. I had no plan, no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than trapped against that door. I found myself what must have been the bedroom. More photos covered the walls here, along with detailed notes about my daily routine. On the bedside table was a collection of things I recognized: a pen I thought I had lost weeks ago, a receipt from my favorite coffee shop, even a small handful of my hair. The realization of how long he had been watching me, how close he had been this whole time, made me feel sick. But I couldn't focus on that now. I needed to find a way out. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway snapped me back to reality. I looked around frantically, my eyes falling on a window unlike the ones in the living room. This one wasn't barred. I rushed over to it, trying to force it open. Years of paint and disuse made it stick, but with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I managed to shove it up. Cool night air rushed in, and I had never smelled anything so sweet. I was on the 4th floor, but there was a fire escape just a few feet to my left. If I could just reach it. Alex, his voice was closer now, just outside the bedroom door. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I didn't hesitate. I climbed out onto the windowsill, my body half in and half out of the apartment. The fire escape was close, but not close enough to simply step onto. I'd have to jump. The bedroom door burst open. Just as I tensed to jump, I heard him shout something, but the blood pounding in my ears drowned it out. I pushed away from the window with all my might, my arms outstretched towards the rusted metal of the fire escape. For a moment, I was flying, then my hands connected with the railing, the impact sending jolts of pain up my arms. But I held on, scrambling to pull myself up and over. I half climbed, half fell down the fire escape, not daring to look back. When I reached the bottom, I jumped the last few feet to the ground and ran. I ran like I had never run before, not stopping until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but finally the engine roared to life. I peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. It wasn't until I was miles away, parked in a brightly lit gas station parking lot, that I finally allowed myself to break down. Sobs racked my body as the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I called the police. Of course, they searched the apartment, but found it empty. He was gone, along with all the photos and evidence of his obsession. They took my statement, promised to keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't have much hope of finding him. I quit my delivery job that night, moved to a new apartment across town. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I see a camera, every time I catch a glimpse of someone watching me for a moment too long, I wonder, is it him? Has he found me again? I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at a late-night food delivery the same way, because sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're the ones inviting you in with a smile and a pizza. Order. The walls seemed to whisper secrets of forgotten lives, each faded poster a silent scream for help. As I stood in that dimly lit room, surrounded by the faces of the missing, I realized I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than an abandoned cabin in the woods. Little did I know my curiosity would lead me down a path I might never escape. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, a chance to clear my head and escape the chaos of city life for a weekend. I'd heard about this secluded trail from a coworker. It's off the beaten path, he'd said, but the views are worth it. What he failed to mention was the eerie feeling of being watched that settled over me the moment I stepped into those woods. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in some parts. One had to constantly check my map and compass to make sure I was heading in the right direction. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was late afternoon when I first saw it, a glint of something through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a lake or a river, the sun reflecting off the water, but as I drew closer, I realized it was the glare of sunlight on a window. The cabin seemed to materialize out of nowhere, a weathered structure of dark wood and sagging roof. It looked old, the kind of place that had stood for generations. Witnessing the slow march of time in silent solitude, I approached cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the carpet of dead leaves. The rational part of my brain told me to turn back, to continue on the trail and pretend I'd never seen this place. But curiosity got the better of me. After all, what harm could come from taking a quick look? The porch creaked ominously under my weight as I approached the front door. It was slightly ajar, car as if inviting me, and I called out a hesitant hello, but only silence answered. I pushed the door open wider, wincing at the loud groan of rusted hinges. The interior was dark, musty, and thick with dust. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating swirling mows of dust. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. The cabin was sparsely furnished. An old couch with springs poking through the fabric, a rickety table with mismatched chairs, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, but it was the walls that caught my attention. Every inch of available space was covered in paper. First, I thought they might be old newspapers or magazine clippings. But as I moved closer, my blood ran cold. They were missing person posters, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, plastered over every surface. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight to get a better look. The faces stared back at me, men, women, children of all ages and races. Some of the posters were yellowed with age, the ink faded and barely legible. Others looked newer, the paper still crisp and white. My hands shook as I examined them more closely. The dates on the posters spanned decades, the earliest I could find dating back to the 1975s. But what really made my skin crawl was the location. Every single poster listed a town or city within a 100-mile radius of where I stood. I moved deeper into the cabin, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. In the kitchen, more posters. In the small bedroom, they covered every surface, even the ceiling. It was like being in a Mauve art gallery, each face a frozen moment of someone's last known whereabouts. As I turned to leave the bedroom, something caught my eye, a poster partially hidden behind others with a face that looked eerily familiar. I peeled it back, my heart pounding in my chest. It was my coworker, the one who had told me about this trail. The poster was dated just 2 weeks ago. I stared at his smiling face, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I had seen him at work the day before I left for this trip. He couldn't be missing unless. A chill ran down my spine as the implication sank. And what if he wasn't missing at all? What if he had sent me here knowing what I would find? The sound of a floorboard creaking behind me made me whirl around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move, but when I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I needed to get out of there now. I made my way back to the front room, moving as quickly and quietly as I could, but something made me pause at the door, a nagging feeling that I couldn't leave without proof, without something to show the authorities. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The walls, the individual posters, close-ups of the dates and locations. I tried to be thorough, knowing this might be my only chance. As I was photographing a section of wall near the front door, I noticed something odd. One of the posters seemed to be covering something. The edge was peeling back slightly, revealing what looked like writing underneath. Against my better judgment, I reached out and carefully peeled back the poster. Underneath, scratched into the wood, were words. As I read them, I felt the blood drain from my face. They know you're here. A sound from outside made me jump. It was faint, but unmistakable, the snap of a twig underfoot. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, bursting out onto the porch and down the rickety steps. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I raised to glance back at the cabin. There in the doorway stood a figure. The fading light cast their face in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me. They raised a hand, almost like they were waving goodbye. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs, my lungs burning and branches whipping at my face. I didn't know if I was being followed, and I didn't dare look back to check. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. The forest had grown dark, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of terror through me. Finally, mercifully, I saw lights ahead. The parking lot where I'd left my car seemed to shimmer like a mirage, a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness of the forest. I scrambled into my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a shape darker than the surrounding night emerging from the tree line. I floored a tire, squealing on the gravel. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, the lights of other cars, and the distant glow of The city never looking so welcoming, I drove straight to the police station. The officer at the desk looked skeptical as I babbled out my story. But when I showed him the pictures on my phone, his expression changed. He disappeared into a back room, returning a few minutes later with a detective. I spent hours at the station repeating my story, showing them the pictures, answering their questions. They seemed particularly interested in the poster of my coworker. When I mentioned that I'd seen him just days ago, the detective exchanged a look with his partner that I couldn't quite interpret. They told me they'd investigate, that they'd send a team out to the cabin first thing in the morning. They advised me not to talk about what I'd seen to anyone for your own safety. They said I went home at night, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces on the posters, their eyes seeming to follow me. I kept replaying the events in my mind, second-guessing every decision I'd made. Should I have left sooner? Should I have never gone into the cabin at all? The next morning, I got a call from the detective. They'd sent a team out to the location I'd given them, but they hadn't found anything. No cabin, no posters, not even a clearing that matched my description. I protested, insisted that I could take them there myself, but when we arrived at the trailhead, nothing looked familiar. The path I remembered taking was nowhere to be found. It was as if the entire experience had been a vivid, terrifying dream. But I know what I saw. The pictures on my phone prove it. Even if the police seem hesitant to accept them as evidence, they say the images could have been doctored, that without the physical evidence of the cabin and the posters, there's not much they can do. My coworker never came back to work. The official story is that he quit suddenly, moved out of state for a new job opportunity. But I know the truth. His face is seared into my memory, smiling out from that missing person poster. I've spent countless hours since then researching the names and faces from the posters. I saw some of them. I've been able to find information about cold cases, mostly people who vanished without a trace over the years, but many of them don't seem to exist in any official records. It's like they've been erased, their disappearances as forgotten as that cabin in the wood. I don't go hiking anymore. I've moved to a new apartment in a busy part of the city, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and the comforting presence of other people. But even here, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes late at night, I think I see a familiar shape in the shadows outside my window, a figure darker than the surrounding darkness, watching and waiting, and I wonder how long before I become just another face on a poster, another forgotten mystery in that cabin of lost souls. The creak of the floorboard echoed through the silent cabin, and I froze. I was supposed to be alone out here, miles from civilization. But that sound, it wasn't the settling of old wood or the wind whistling through cracks. No, that was the unmistakable sound of a footstep. And it was coming from right outside my bedroom door. I'd rented this cabin for a week, desperate for some solitude after months of grinding at work. The listing had promised seclusion, and it delivered. The narrow dirt road leading here had been almost impassable in my city car, winding through dense forest for miles before finally opening up to reveal a picturesque log cabin nestled against a backdrop of towering pine. The first couple of days had been blissful. I had hiked the surrounding trails, read books by the fireplace, and enjoyed the kind of silence you can only find when you're truly alone in nature. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, not even a landline, just me in the wilderness. But on the third night, things changed. It started with little things. A chair I could have sworn I'd tucked under the kitchen table was pulled out. When I came in from a hike, a book I had left on the coffee table was suddenly on the shelf. Small enough discrepancies that I could almost convince myself I was imagining things that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. Then came the noises, soft at first, easily dismissed as the natural sounds of the forest, but they grew bolder, more distinct. The snap of a twig outside my window as I was drifting in off to sleep, the shuffle of feet on the porch in the dead of night each time I'd work up the courage to investigate, heart pounding as I peered out into the darkness, and each time I'd see nothing but the silent, indifferent forest staring back at me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the quiet and isolation were making me jumpy, causing me to read too much into every little sound, but deep down a primal part of me knew better. It knew we were not meant to be alone in the dark, that our ancestors huddled together in caves for a reason. It whispered that something was out there watching, waiting. And now, lying in bed on the fourth night, that whisper had become a scream, because that footstep outside my door, that was real as the icy fear gripping my heart, as real as the sweat beating on my forehead. I held my breath, straining my ears for any further sound. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the thunderous pounding of my own heartbeat, and the soft rustle of wind through pine needles outside. Then another creak, closer this time. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. They landed on the heavy metal flashlight on the nightstand. I reached for it, slowly trying not to make a sound. As my fingers closed around its cold surface, the door handle began to turn achingly slow. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white with the effort of keeping still, of not screaming or running or doing any of the 100 things my panicked brain was screaming at me to do. The door swung open. In the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains, I could make out a silhouette, tall, broader than any human should be, with a shape that seemed wrong somehow, not quite proportioned like a person ought to be. For a heartbeat, we both remained motionlessly paralyzed with fear on the bed, the figure a looming presence in the doorway, head cocked slightly as if studying me. Then it moved. I didn't think I reacted with a yell that was equal parts terror and defiance. I hurled the flashlight at the intruder. It connected with a dull thud, and the figure stumbled back with a grunt that sounded disturbing and human. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I leapt from the bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and barreled past the stunned intruder. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of eyes reflecting green in the moonlight, but my mind refused to process what I was seeing. I ran through the cabin, not daring to look back. The front door was locked. Had I done that? No time to remember now. I fumbled with the dead bolt, my sweaty hands slipping on the cool metal behind me. I could hear heavy footsteps, a low growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. The lock finally gave way, and I burst out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I leapt off the steps, my bare feet hitting the damp earth, and I ran. I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to put as much distance between myself and whatever was in that cabin as possible. The forest was a dark blur around me, branches whipping at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours, time lost, all meaning in the primal fear that drove me forward. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I pushed on. Finally, I couldn't go any further. I collapsed against a tree, gulping in great lungfuls of air. As my panic slowly subsided, I began to take stock of my situation. I was alone in the woods in the middle of the night, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and shorts. I had no shoes, no phone, no idea which direction the cabin was in. And something I couldn't even begin to comprehend was out here with me. A twig snapped in the darkness behind me. I whirled around, pressing my back against the rough bark of the tree, my eyes strained against the gloom, searching for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath, an unnatural silence settling over everything. Then I saw them, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Not just one pair, but several surrounding me on all sides. They blinked slowly, methodically, like predators sizing up their prey. A low growl rumbled through the night, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt it in my chest, a primal sound that spoke of hunger and violence. This was Yet I thought, this is how I die alone in the woods, torn apart by what my mind still couldn't wrap itself around, what I'd seen in the cabin, what I was seeing now. But as the eyes drew closer, as dark shapes began to materialize from the shadows, a strange calm settled over me. The fear was still there, but it was muted now, overshadowed by a grim acceptance. If this was my end, I would face it standing. I pushed off from the tree, standing as tall as I could. "What are you?" I called out, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then a voice spoke from the darkness. It was rough, guttural, as if human speech was an ill-fitting garment. "War with discomfort, we are the forgotten," it said, "the ones who walked these woods long before your kind came. We are hunger, we are the night. And you are trespassing." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I didn't know the cabin. I rented it. I didn't mean to intrude. A harsh sound echoed through the trees. It took me a moment to realize it was laughter. Rented, the voice grave, as if this land could be owned, could be parceled out and sold. You humans, always thinking you can claim what isn't yours. The shapes were closer now. I could make out shaggy forms, hunched and powerful. They moved with an unsettling mixture of animal grace and near human posture. "What will you do with me?" I asked, hating the tremor that had crept back into my voice. There was a pause, as if they were considering. "Then we should kill you, rend your flesh, crack your bones. It's been so long since we've tasted human meat." I closed my eyes, waiting for the attack, but it didn't come. But the voice continued, "We are not mindless beasts. We remember the old ways, the rules of hospitality. You came in ignorance, not malice. So we will grant you a choice." My eyes snapped open. "A choice, yes. You may leave these woods, never to return. Speak of what you've seen to no one. Live out your days with the memory of this night haunting your dreams. Or I prompted, when the voice trailed off. "Or you may stay, become one of us. Leave behind your human life with all its noise and confusion. Embrace the simplicity of the hunt, the purity of the wild." I stood there, stunned. Part of me, a larger part than I cared to admit, was tempted by the offer to shed the complications of modern life, to run free in the woods, unfettered by social expectations or responsibilities. It was seductive in its primal simplicity. But as I looked at the creatures surrounding me, as I thought about what such a transformation would mean, I knew I couldn't do it. I wasn't ready to give up my humanity, no matter how alluring the alternative might seem in this moment of fear and adrenaline. I need to leave," I said finally. "I'm sorry for intruding on your territory. I promise I'll never come back. I won't tell anyone what I've seen here." A low murmur passed through the gathered creatures. Finally, the one who had been speaking stepped forward in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. I could see it clearly for the first time. It was like something out of a nightmare, part wolf, part bear, part man, yet wholly its own terrifying entity. "So be it," it growled, "but know this, human, the wild places of the world are shrinking. One day there will be nowhere left for us to hide. When that day comes, we will remember those who respected our boundaries and those who did not." With that, the creature turned and loped off into the darkness. One by one, the other followed, melting into the shadows, until I was alone once more. I sank to my knees, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving me shaky and exhausted. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I found my way back to the cabin. I packed my things in a daze, drove down that winding dirt road, and didn't stop until I was back in the familiar confines of the city. I've kept my promise. I've never told anyone about what happened at night, but sometimes, when the city feels too cramped, too noisy, too human, I find myself looking towards the distant mountains, and for a brief moment, I wonder what might have been if I'd made a different choice in those dark woods the first time I found blood on Sarah's sheets. I told myself it was an accident. By the third time, I knew something was terribly wrong. My roommate was hiding a dark secret and I was beginning to fear that uncovering it might cost me everything. I met Sarah at the start of our sophomore year of college. We were both looking for a roommate, tired of the chaos of dorm life and eager for a bit more independence. She seemed perfect, quiet, studious, with a dry sense of humor that mattered my own. We found a small 2-bedroom apartment just off campus and moved in together. The first few months were great. We fell into an easy rhythm, studying together in the evenings, occasionally going out for coffee or a movie. Sarah was an art major, and I'd often find her sketching late into the night, her brow furrowed in concentration as she brought her visions to life on paper. It was about 4 months into our living arrangement when I first noticed something off. I was doing laundry. It was my turn that week when I saw a small blood stain on Sarah's sheets. It wasn't unusual in itself. Accidents happened, but when I mentioned it to her later just to make sure she was okay, her reaction struck me as odd. She froze for a moment, her eyes widening slightly before she forced a laugh. "Oh," that she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I must have nicked myself shaving or something. Thanks for washing it out." I nodded, but something about her response didn't sit right with me. It felt rehearsed, like she'd been expecting the question. But I brushed it off. After all, it was just a small blood stain, nothing to worry about. A few weeks later it happened again. This time, the stain was larger, and there were several of them scattered across the sheet. Again, I mentioned it to Sarah, and again she brushed it off with a vague explanation about a nasal bed. By the third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sheets were practically soaked, and this time I found a bloody towel stuffed at the bottom of the hamper. When I confronted Sarah, her face went pale. "It's nothing. I've just had some health problems. It's under control." But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she took the sheets from me. Something was very wrong, and Sarah was terrified that someone would find out what it was. Attention to Sarah's behavior. I noticed things I'd overlooked before: how she'd sometimes disappear for hours without explanation, the way she'd flinch at unexpected noises, the locked box she kept under her bed, which I'd once glimpsed her opening, revealing a glint of metal inside. One night, I woke to the sound of muffled sobbing coming from Sarah's room. I lay there in the darkness, debating whether to check on her. Just as I decided to get up, I heard her door open, footsteps padded down the hall, then the front door opened and closed. I waited a few minutes, then crept out of bed. Sarah's room was empty, her window open to the fire escape on her desk, her sketchbook lay open. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through it. What I saw made my blood run cold. Page after page of disturbing images, dark twisted figures with too many limbs, scenes of violence and gore rendered in exquisite detail, and scattered throughout portraits of a man I'd never seen before. In some he looked normal, in others his face was distorted, monstrous. I heard a noise outside and quickly closed the sketchbook, retreating to my room through my window. I saw Sarah climbing back up the fire escape. She was wearing all black, and as she slipped back into her room, I caught a glimpse of something in her hand, something that glinted in the moonlight. The next morning, Sarah acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, chatted about her classes, even laughed at one of my lame jokes. But there was a tension in her shoulders, a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I spent the day debating what to do. Should I confront her, call the police? What if I was misreading everything, and there was a perfectly innocent explanation? That evening, as we were studying in the living room, I decided to take a chance. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "is everything okay? You seemed, I don't know, on edge lately." She stiffened her pencil, pausing mid-sketch. "Everything's fine," she said. "Not me, my eyes. Just stressed about midterms, you know." I took a deep breath. "It's just the blood on your sheets, your disappearances. And last night, I heard you leave." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand. she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't know it's not safe. What's not safe?" I pressed. "Sarah, whatever's going on, I want to help. You can trust me." For a moment, I thought she might open up. I saw the struggle play out on her face, the desire to unburden herself wearing with fear, but then her expression hardened. "I need some air," she said abruptly, standing up. "Don't wait up." Before I could say anything else, she was gone, the door slamming behind her. I sat there for a long time staring at the door. Part of me wanted to follow her to demand answers, but another part, a part one wasn't proud of, was afraid of what those answers might be. Around midnight, I heard her return. I pretended to be asleep as she moved around the apartment. I heard water running in the bathroom, then the sound of her bedroom door closing. The next morning, Sarah was gone. Before I woke up, she'd left a note on the kitchen counter, "Gone to visit family for a few days. See you next week." I stood there reading and rereading the note. It was so normal, so mundane, as if the tension of the past few weeks, the blood, the secrets, had all been in my imagination. But I knew better, and I knew I couldn't just let this go. While Sarah was away, I did some digging. I searched her name online, looked through her social media, what little there was of it. I found nothing unusual. Sarah Parker, 20 years old, art student, no criminal record, no strange affiliations. It was when I started looking into her family that things got weird. I couldn't find any record of them. No parents listed on her college application, no siblings mentioned on Facebook. It was as if Sarah had sprung into existence, fully formed at the age of 18. On a hunch, I tried searching for the man from her sketches. I didn't have a name, but I had a face. After hours of scrolling through image searches, I found him. Dr. Marcus Heller, professor of anthropology at a university across the country, specialized in occult practices and fringe religious movements, disappeared 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances. My heart was pounding as I read the article about his disappearance. Colleagues described him as brilliant but unstable, obsessed with proving the existence of what he called hidden realities. The police had investigated, but the trail had gone cold, and now somehow Sarah was connected to him. I was still staring at the article when I heard the front door open. Sarah was back a day earlier than she'd said. I quickly closed my laptop, trying to compose myself, but when Sarah walked into the living room, one look at her face told me she knew. "You've been looking into me," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sarah sighed, sinking into the armchair across from me. She looked exhausted, defeated. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this," she said softly. "I really liked living with you. You know, it felt normal." "Sarah," I said, finding my voice at last, "what's going on? Who are you really?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of fear. "My real name is Emily Heller," she said. "Marcus Heller was my father." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Was Sarah?" Emily nodded. "He's dead. I killed him." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and irrevocable. I wanted to run, to call the police, and to wake up from this nightmare, but I stayed where I was, waiting for her to continue. "My father wasn't who everyone thought he was." She went on. "His research, his obsession with the occult, it wasn't academic. He found something real, and it changed him." She told me a story that seemed impossible about ancient rituals and entities from beyond our reality, about how her father had made contact with something he shouldn't have, how it had possessed him, twisted him into something inhuman. "The blood," I said, remembering the stained sheets, "the nights you disappeared." Emily nodded. "It's still out there, the thing that took my father. It wants to finish what it started. I'm the only one who can stop it, but every time I fight it, I come back bloodied." I sat there trying to process everything she was saying. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but I'd seen the fear in her eyes, the conviction in her voice, and deep down I knew she was telling the truth. What happens now? I asked. Emily stood up, moving to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room now. She said, you have a choice. You can walk away from this, move out, forget everything I've told you, live a normal life. Or she turned back to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and resignation. Or you can help me, but I warn you, if you choose this path, there's no going back. Your life will never be normal again. I looked at her, this girl I thought I knew, who had turned out to be so much more than I could have imagined. I thought about the normal life I could have, the safety of ignorance, and I thought about the darkness she faced, the battle she fought alone. In that moment, I made my choice. Tell me everything, I said. Tell me how I can help. Emily's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a genuine smile cross her face. As the last light of day faded, she began to talk, and I listened, knowing that my life had just changed forever. The blood on the sheets had been just the beginning. Now I was stepping into a world of shadows and secrets, of ancient evils, and the brave few who stood against them. And somehow, I knew that this, not the safe, normal life I'd always imagined, was where I was meant to be. The moment I stepped through that crumbling doorway, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, but beneath that lingered something else, a scent that spoke of secrets long buried and horrors best left undisturbed. I should have turned back then, should have heeded the warnings whispered by the wind through broken windows. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and it was about to lead me into a nightmare from which I might never wake. I'd always been fascinated by urban legends, those stories that skirt the edges of believability and sin. Shivers down your spine. So when I heard about the old Ferguson house on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist investigating. The stories varied, as they often do with these things. Some said the house was haunted by the ghosts of the Ferguson family, who'd all died mysteriously one winter night in the 1950s. Others claimed it was a portal to another dimension, that people who went in never came out quite the same. If they came out at all, most locals avoided the place, crossing themselves when they drove past and hurrying their children along if they lingered too long staring at its dilapidated facade. But to me, it was irresistible. I chose a gloomy Tuesday afternoon for my expedition. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, which seemed fitting for the task at hand. I parked my car a little way down the road, not wanting to draw attention to myself. As I approached on foot, the house loomed before me, a decaying giant of peeling paint and rotting wood. The front gate hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking ominously. As I pushed it open, weeds choked the once manicured lawn, and the porch steps groaned under my weight. I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob. This was my last chance to turn back, to chalk this up to a moment of foolishness and return to the safety of the known world. But I didn't. I turned the knob, surprised to find it unlocked, and stepped inside. The interior was a study, and decayed wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing the bare bones of the house beneath. Furniture lay scattered and broken, as if a great storm had torn through the place. Dust motes danced into the weak light filtering through grimy windows, giving the air a hazy, dreamlike quality. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. In what must have been the living room, a grand fireplace stood silent sentinel, its mantel adorned with faded photographs. I picked one up, wiping away years of grime with my thumb. A family smiled back at me, mother, father, 2 children, the Fergusons. I presumed they looked happy, normal. What had happened to them? As I set the photo down, a noise from upstairs made me freeze. It was faint, barely audible, but in the stillness of the house it might as well have been a gunshot, a creak of floorboards, as if someone or something was moving around up there. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just the house settling old, wood responding to changes in temperature. But another part of me, a more primal part, screamed that I wasn't alone. I should have left and any sane person would have, but that damn curiosity of mine won out again. I found myself moving towards the stairs, each step an eternity. As the old would groan beneath my feet, the upper floor was, if possible, in even worse shape than the ground level here. The smell of decay was stronger, mingled with something else, a coppery tang that tickled the back of my throat. I moved down the hallway, peering into rooms. As I passed a child's bedroom, frozen in time, dusty toys still scattered across the floor, a bathroom, its mirror cracked and clouded, a master bedroom, the bed still made as if waiting for its owners to return. And then I reached the last door. Unlike the others, this one was closed. As I stood before it, I could have sworn I heard something on the other side, a whisper perhaps, or the rustle of movement. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this house, and never look back, but I couldn't stop. Now I had to know. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The room beyond was dark, the windows boarded up. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to discern shapes in the gloom. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of various sizes, and in those jars I stumbled back, while rising in my throat human remains, pieces of people preserved in murky fluid, hands, feet, eyes that seemed to stare accusingly at me through the glass. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the center of the room was a table, and on that table lay something that had once been human. It was twisted, changed, its limbs elongated, and its skin a sickly gray. Its chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. It was alive. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, I'm not sure, but suddenly its eyes snapped open. They were entirely black, like bottomless pits, and they fixed directly on me. I ran like I've never run before, stumbling down the stairs, through the decaying rooms, out into the fading afternoon light. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my lungs burning, and my heart feeling like it might explode out of my chest. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the house. There, in an upstairs window, I saw a figure, not the twisted thing from the room, but a man. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, with graying hair. He smiled and waved, as if we were nothing more than neighbors greeting each other across a fence. I drove away, my tires squealing on the asphalt. I didn't slow down until I was back in town, surrounded by the comforting signs of normal life, people walking, dogs, children playing, the familiar glow of street lights coming on as dusk fell. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those jars, the thing on the table, the man waving from the window. I told myself it wasn't real, that I'd imagined it all, a product of an overactive imagination and too many urban legends. But deep down I knew the truth. What I'd seen in that house was real, and somehow I knew it wasn't over. The next day I went to the local library, determined to find out more about the Ferguson house and its history. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, grew pale when I mentioned it. "Why do you want to know about that place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. As I recounted my experience, her eyes grew wider and wider. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said. "No one should ever go there." She told me a story, then one that had been passed down through generations in the town. The Fergusons, she said, had not been what they seemed. They were practitioners of dark arts, seekers of forbidden knowledge. They had delved into realms best left unexplored, and in doing so had unleashed something terrible. The night they died, Margaret said, her voice trembling, the whole town could hear the screams. When the police finally broke down the door, they found, well, they never spoke about what they found, but those who went in were never the same afterwards. I thought of it. Jars, the thing on the table, and shuddered, but I saw someone there. I said, a man waving from the window. Margaret's face went even paler. That's impossible, she whispered. No one has lived in that house for 60 years. As I left the library, my mind was reeling. What had I stumbled into? What was really going on in that house? Over the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I went to work, met friends for drinks, did all the normal things that make up a life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I felt watched all the time. I catch glimpses of moving him out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. And then the dream started. Terrible nightmares of that room of jars, filled with writhing things that used to be human, of the man from the window smiling as he approached me with a knife. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the coppery smell from the house seeming to linger in my nostrils. A week after my visit to the Ferguson house, I came home to find a package on my doorstep. There was no return address, no postmark, just my name written in an elegant old-fashioned script with trembling hands. I opened it. Inside was a single jar identical to the ones I'd seen in that room, and floating in the cloudy liquid within was a human. Its iris, a striking blue taped to the jar, was a note. You saw, now you're part of it. We'll be seeing you soon. I don't know what to do. I can't go to the police. Who would believe me? I can't leave town somehow. I know they'd find me wherever I went. All I can do is wait and wonder when they'll come for me. So, if you're reading this, heed my warning. Stay away from the Ferguson house. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because once you step inside, once you see what lurks in the shadows of that place, you can never truly leave. And remember, if you ever find a package on your doorstep with no return address, don't open it. Run as far and as fast as you can, because by then it might already be too late. The headlights in my rearview mirror were relentless, an unblinking gaze that had followed me for miles down this deserted highway. At first, I thought it was just another late-night traveler, but as the minutes ticked by and the car behind me matched my every move, a chilling realization set in. This was no coincidence. Someone was following me, and out here, in the middle of nowhere, I was completely alone. It had started as a normal drive home from visiting my parents. I'd left later than I'd planned. The goodbyes and just one more cup of coffee stretching into the evening. By the time I hit the road, the sun had already set, leaving me to navigate the long stretch of highway that cut through miles of empty farmland and patches of dense forest. I'd always loved driving at night. There was something peaceful about it. The world narrowed down to the pool of light from my headlights and the hypnotic white lines of the road. But tonight, that peace was shattered by the persistent presence behind me. I first noticed the car about an hour into my drive. It was nothing special, just a dark sedan that blended in with the night. But as I drove on, I realized it was staying a consistent distance behind me, never passing even when I slowed down, never falling back when I sped up. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just someone heading in the same direction, maybe another family visitor heading home. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, then two, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. I tried all the usual UAL tricks. I varied my speed, slowing down to let them pass, then speeding up well over the limit. The car matched my pace exactly. I put on my turn signal as if I was going to exit, then stayed on the highway. At the last second, the car behind me did the same. By now my heart was racing. This wasn't normal behavior. Whoever was behind me was definitely following me, and out here with no other cars in sight, and the next town miles away, I felt incredibly vulnerable. I checked my cell phone and hoping to call for help, but of course there was no signal. Just my luck to be in one of the few dead zones left in the country. As I wrestled with what to do next, the car behind me suddenly sped up. In seconds, it was right on my bumper, so close I couldn't even see its headlights in my rearview mirror anymore. My hands clenched, the steering wheel knuckles white with fear. Then, without warning, the car swerved into the left lane and pulled up alongside me. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, too terrified to look over, but I could feel the other cars' windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but as I watched the driver's window begin to roll down, I snapped my eyes back to the road. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. What did they want? Were they going to try and run me off the road? My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. A long and loud honking made me jump in my seat. The other car was signaling for me to pull over. Fat chance of that happening. If anything, I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The other driver matched my speed, staying right beside me. Then I heard a voice carried on the wind rushing between our cars. Pull over, you need to pull over now. It was a man's voice, deep and insistent. I shook my head more to myself than to him. There was no way I was stopping out here in the middle of nowhere with this lunatic. The man's voice came again, more urgent. This time, your back tire, it's about to blow. Pull over my back tire. I risked a glance at my side mirror, but I couldn't see anything wrong. This had to be a trick, right? Some ploy to get me to stop, so he could rob me worse. But a seed of doubt had been planted. What if he was telling the truth? What if my tire was about to blow out at these speeds on this empty road that could be deadly? I had a split second to make a decision. Trust this stranger who had been following me for hours, or risk a potentially fatal accident. In that moment, survival instinct won out over caution. I eased my foot off the gas and steered towards the shoulder, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The other car followed suit, pulling up behind me. As soon as I stopped, I threw my car into park and grabbed my phone again, ready to dial 911. The second I got any hint of a signal, I watched in my mirrors. As the driver's door of the other car opened, a man stepped out in the dim light from our cars. I could see he was middle-aged with graying hair and a kind face that seemed at odds with the terror he just put me through. He approached my car slowly, his hands held up in a non-threatening gesture. I cracked my window just enough to hear him. "I'm so sorry to frighten you," he said, his voice genuinely apologetic, "but your back right tire is shredding. Another few miles and it would have blown out completely." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process this turn of events. "What, how do you know?" Then he gestured to my car. "I noticed it about an hour ago. There's a strip of rubber flapping in the dark. You probably couldn't see it in your mirrors. I tried to catch up to you to let you know, but you kept speeding up. I was afraid you'd crash before I could warn you." My suspicion would with relief. Could this be true? And had I really misjudged the situation so badly? "Look for yourself," he said, stepping back from the car. "But be careful, the tire might go at any moment." Whaley, I opened my door and stepped out. Sure enough, when I walked around to the back of my car, I saw it. A long strip of rubber was peeling away from my right rear tire, flapping loosely. The man was right. If I'd kept driving, it would have blown out entirely. The realization of how close I'd come to a serious accident made my knees weak. I leaned against my car, suddenly elated. "Are you okay?" the man asked, concern evident in his voice. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. Now that the adrenaline was wearing off, I felt shaky and a little nauseous. "I'm Tom, by the way," he said, offering a small smile. "I'm sorry again for scaring you. I know how it must have looked, me following you like that. I should have found a better way to get your attention." I introduced myself, still feeling a bit dazed. "Thank you," I added. "You might have saved my life." Tom nodded, happy to help. "Now let's see about getting that tire changed, shall we? You've got a spare, I hope." For the next half hour, Tom helped me change my tire. As we worked, he told me about his job as a long-haul trucker, how he'd seen countless accidents caused by blown tires. "Well, that's why I always keep an eye out for other drivers," he explained, "especially at night. It's dangerous out here." By the time we finished, my fear had been replaced by gratitude and More than a little embarrassment at how I'd misjudged the situation, Tom refused my offers of payment, waving them off with a smile. "Just pay it forward," he said. "Keep an eye out for others on the road. We've all got to look out for each other out here." As I watched Tom drive away, I was struck by how quickly things can change in the span of a few hours. I'd gone from terror to relief, from suspicion to gratitude. I'd been so quick to assume the worst, to see danger where there was only a stranger trying to help. The rest of my drive home was uneventful, but it gave me plenty of time to reflect. I thought about how fear can distort our perceptions, how easy it is to see threats in every shadow, but I also thought about Tom and how there are still good people out there willing to go out of their way to help a stranger. As I pulled into my driveway, exhausted but safe, I made a promise to myself I would try to be more like Tom, to look out for others, to offer help even when it might be misunderstood, because sometimes the real danger isn't the strange danger behind you on a dark road. Sometimes the real danger is in letting fear close our hearts to the possibility of human kindness. The next time I saw headlights in my rearview mirror on a lonely stretch of road, I didn't feel fear. Instead, I smiled, remembering Tom and the lesson he taught me about trust, kindness, and the unexpected ways we can look out for each other in this unpredictable journey we call life. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, her words spilling out in a frantic whisper. "Please, you have to help me. They're coming." In that moment, as we stood in the flickering light of the deserted rest stop, I realized my quiet night drive had just taken a turn into a nightmare. I never could have imagined it was just past midnight, and I'd been on the road for hours. As a long-haul trucker, I was used to these endless nights, the hypnotic white lines of the highway stretching out before me. But something about this night felt different. The air was heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. I'd pulled into the rest stop more out of habit than necessity. It was one of those small, isolated places you find dotting the highways, just a few dim lights, a couple of vending machines, and a block of weather restrooms. As I stepped out of my truck, stretching my legs, I noticed how quiet it was. No other vehicles, no distant hum of traffic, just the soft buzz of insects and the whisper of wind through the trees. That's when I saw her. A girl, couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, emerged from the shadows near the restrooms. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her hair a tangled mess, but it was her eyes that caught me, wide, frantic, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. She approached me cautiously, like a wounded animal, unsure whether to trust or flee. "Please," she said again, her voice barely audible. "You have to help me. I've been held. I escaped, but they'll be looking for me." My mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. Held, escaped. Who were they? Part of me wanted to believe this was some kind of prank or misunderstanding, but the fear in her eyes, the trembling of her hands, this was real. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "It's all right. You're safe now. Let's get you in my truck, and we'll call the police." She nodded, relief flooding her face. But as we turned towards my truck, headlights suddenly cut through the darkness. A van pulled into the rest stop, its engine a low growl in the quiet night. The girl froze, her body tensing like a coiled spring. "It's them," she whispered, terror etching every syllable. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed her hand, and we ran for my truck. I could hear car doors slamming behind us, footsteps on gravel. We reached my rig, and I all but lifted the girl into the passenger seat before scrambling in myself as I turned the key in the ignition. I got my first good look at our pursuers. 3 men were approaching, their faces hard, eyes glinting with a coldness that sent shivers down my spine. The one in front, a tall man with gray hair, called out in a voice that was surprisingly calm. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone almost friendly. "That's my daughter. She's not well. You see, ran away from the hospital. We've been looking everywhere for her." I glanced at the girl. She was shaking her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. He's lying, she choked out. Please don't let them take me. In that moment, I had to make a choice: believe this man, with his calm demeanor and plausible story, or trust my gut in. The terrified girl beside me, the decision took less than a heartbeat. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the rest stop, tires screeching on the asphalt in my side mirror. I saw the men running back to their van within moments. They were behind us, headlights blazing. Hold on, I told the girl as I pushed the accelerator to the floor. My rig wasn't built for speed, but I knew these roads. I had to hope that would be enough. For the next hour, we played a terrifying game of cat and mouse along the dark highway. The van stayed close behind us, no matter how I tried to lose them. The girl who told me her name was Emily filled me in on bits and pieces of her story between sobbing breaths. She'd been taken almost 2 years ago, snatched off the street in broad daylight. There were others, she said, girls and boys kept in a compound somewhere in the mountains. She'd managed to escape during a transfer, slipping away at a gas station and hiding in the woods until she found the rest stop. As she talked, my horror grew. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was something larger, more organized, the kind of a thing you hear whispers about but never want to believe is real. We were approaching a town when I saw the van pull alongside us. The passenger window rolled down, and I saw the barrel of a gun pointing straight at us. Pull over now, the man from earlier shouted, his friendly demeanor gone, or we start shooting. Emily whimpered beside me, curling into a ball in her seat. I knew our odds weren't good. My truck could take a beating, but all it would take was one lucky shot to blow out of the tire, and we'd be done. That's when I saw it, a police station just ahead on the right. It was a small town outfit, probably closed this time of night, but it was our best shot. Hold on tight, I told Emily. Then, without warning, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. My truck plowed through the chain link fence surrounding the police station's parking lot like it was made of paper. The van, caught off guard by my sudden move, screeched past us before slamming on its brakes. I didn't stop until we were right up against the front doors of the station. The crash had set off alarms, and I could already hear sirens in the distance. Come on, I said to Emily, helping her down from the cab. We're going to be okay now. The men from the van were out now, looking unsure. The one with the gun raised it, pointing it at us, but the sound of approaching sirens made him hesitate. It was the longest 4 minutes of my life, standing there with Emily behind me, watching these men decide whether to shoot us or run. In the end, self-preservation won out. They piled back into their van and sped off just as the first police car rounded the corner. What followed was a whirlwind of questions, statements, and barely contained chaos. Emily was taken to the hospital, and I spent hours talking to local cops and then FBI agents who showed up as the sun was rising. They found the compound Emily had told me about. 3 days later, 17 kids were rescued, some of whom had been missing for years. The men who had chased us were arrested trying to cross the Canadian border. Months later, after the trials were over and the media frenzy had died down, I received a letter. It was from Emily. She wrote about her recovery, her reunion with her family, her plans for the future. But what stuck with me were her final words. You could have driven away that night. You could have believed their lies or decided it wasn't your problem. But you didn't. You chose to help a stranger. And in doing so, you saved not just my life, but the lives of so many others. I'll never be able to thank you enough, but I promise to live my life in a way that honors what you did for me. You're my hero, and I'll never forget you. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my wallet, where I keep it to this day. Sometimes on long nights, when the road seems endless and the world feels cold, I take it out and read it again. It reminds me that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope. And sometimes all it takes to change a life or many lives is the courage to help a stranger in need. As I drive my routes now, I keep a sharper eye out at those lonely rest stops, not out of fear, but with the knowledge that you never know when you might be called upon to make a difference. That night changed me, showed me the depths of both human cruelty and human resilience, but more than anything it taught me that we all have the power to be heroes in our own way. All we have to do is be willing to act when the moment comes. The key turned in the lock with an ominous click, and I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. What we thought was just another room in our new home was about to reveal a secret that would shatter our lives forever. As the door swung open, the musty air carried with it the whispers of a past we were never meant to uncover. We'd been so excited when we found the house Sarah in. I had been looking for months, trying to find the perfect place to start our family. This Victorian beauty with its wraparound porch and intricate woodwork seemed like a dream come true. Sure, it needed some work, but at that price, we couldn't pass it up. The realtor had been vague about the previous owners, mentioning only that the house had been in probate for a while. We didn't think much of it at the time. Old houses often came with complicated histories, and we were more focused on the future we were going to build there. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of moving boxes, painting walls, and planning renovations. We threw ourselves into making the house our own, reveling in the excitement of home ownership. But as the days passed, little things started to nag at me. It was nothing major at first, just odd noises in the night, the feeling of being watched when I was alone in a room. I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of a new place, the settling of an old house. Sarah teased me about being jumpy, but I could see the unease in her eyes too. Then we found the door. It was hidden behind an old wardrobe in what we planned to make the nursery. We only discovered it when we were moving furniture around, trying to decide on the perfect layout for the baby's room. The wardrobe had left marks on the faded wallpaper, and as I was examining them, my hand brushed against something that felt different, a seam in the wall, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. Curious, we pulled the wallpaper away, revealing a door that had been papered over. It was solid oak with an antique brass lock that looked far newer than it should have been. We searched the house for a key that might fit, but came up empty-handed. That door became an obsession for us. What was behind it? Why had someone gone to such lengths to hide it? We debated calling a locksmith, but something held us back. It felt like crossing a line, like we'd be intruding on something we weren't meant to see. But the mystery ate at us. We'd lie awake at night speculating about what could be hidden in our own home, a secret room, valuable antiques, or something darker. It was Sarah who finally made the decision. She came home one day with a locksmith card in hand. "I can't take it anymore," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "We need to know." The locksmith arrived the next morning. He was an older man with kind eyes and gnarled hands that spoke of decades of experience. As he worked on the lock, he chatted amiably about other old houses he'd worked on, the secrets they'd held. "You'd be surprised," he said, his tools clicking softly in the lock. "People hide all sorts of things in these old places. Once found a whole room full of prohibition, a hooch behind a fake wall." I laughed nervously, trying to ignore them. Knot of anxiety in my stomach. What would we find? Part of me was thrilled at the prospect of uncovering some hidden treasure, but another part, a lock, finally gave way. With a soft click, the locksmith stepped back, a satisfied smile on his face. "There you go, folks. Whatever's in there, it's all yours now." Sarah and I exchanged a look. This was it, the moment of truth. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The smell hit us, first musty and stale, with an underlying sweetness that turned my stomach. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, shapes began to emerge. In the middle of the room stood a large table, its surface covered in papers and what looked like scientific equipment, but it was the back wall that caught our attention. illuminated by the faint light that filtered in through the doorway. A huge corkboard hung with photographs pinned to it, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, overlapping and crowding each other. As we stepped closer, the details came into focus, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The photos were of people, men, women, children, all ages and races. But they weren't normal photos. These people looked terrified, their faces contorted in fear or pain. Some were bound, others showed signs of injury, and beside each photo was a date and a set of notes in cramped, meticulous handwriting. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand clutching mine so tight it hurt. "What is this?" I couldn't answer. My eyes had landed on a familiar face among the photos. It was our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, the sweet old lady who had brought us a welcome pie when we first moved in the photo. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with terror. The date on the photo was from last year. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke or a movie prop left behind by previous owners. But deep down, I knew this was real. We had stumbled into something dark and terrible, something that had been happening right under our noses. Sarah's scream snapped me back to reality. She was pointing at another photo, her hand shaking. It was us. The picture had clearly been taken recently, showing Sarah and me standing on our front porch, unaware we were being watched. The date was from just a week ago, and beside it was a single word that made my blood run cold. Soon we ran. We didn't stop to grab anything, didn't pause to lock the front door behind us. We just ran, piling into our car and speeding away from the house that had so quickly transformed from our dream home into a nightmare. We went straight to the police station, our words tumbling out in a frantic jumble as we tried to explain what we'd found. The officers looked skeptical at first, but something in our terror must have convinced them. They sent a team to the house immediately. What they found confirmed our worst fears. The room was a meticulous record of decades of abductions and murders. The books on the shelves were journals detailing each crime in horrifying detail. The equipment on the table was for processing victims, and in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards they found human remains. The investigation that followed turned our quiet neighborhood upside down. It turned out the previous owner of our house, a man named Gerald Hoffman, had been a serial killer, active for over 30 years. He had died of a heart attack 6 months before we bought the house, taking his secrets to the grave. Or so he thought. The case made national news. Families of long missing persons finally got answers. Cold cases were solved, and our little town became synonymous with the horrors that had been hidden behind closed doors. As for Sarah and me, we couldn't stay. The house, once so full of promise, now felt tainted beyond redemption. We sold it for a fraction of what we'd paid, not caring about the financial loss. We just wanted to get away, to try and forget what we'd seen. We moved across the country trying to outrun the nightmares that followed us, but some things you can't escape. I still wake up in cold sweats. The faces from those photographs burned into my memory. Sarah jumped at every unexpected noise, and the excitement we once felt about starting a family had been replaced by a deep-seated fear of the world we'd be bringing a child into. They say ignorance is bliss, and now I understand why we had uncovered a truth too terrible to bear, a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. Our innocence, our sense of safety in the world had been shattered the moment the key turned in the lock. As I sit here writing this down, I can't help but wonder how many other houses hold similar secrets. How many other families are living their lives blissfully unaware of the horrors that might be hidden behind their walls. I don't have answers. All I know is that sometimes locked doors are locked for a reason, and some secrets once revealed can never be forgotten. Our new home is small, with no hidden rooms or mysterious locked doors, and that's exactly how we like it. The first time I noticed the vase had moved. I told myself I was imagining things by the third time. I knew someone or something was in the house with me. What I didn't know was that my quiet house sitting gig was about to become a waking nightmare. It was supposed to be an easy job. My friend Sarah was going on a month-long trip to Europe, and she needed someone to watch her house and take care of her cat. I jumped at the chance. A whole month in a beautiful Victorian home away from my noisy apartment and annoying roommates. It sounded like heaven. The first few days were blissful. I spent my time exploring the house, admiring Sarah's eclectic art collection, and curling up with a good book in the suite. The cat, Mr. Whiskers, was aloof but low maintenance. I fell into an easy routine of working remotely during the day and enjoying the peace and quiet in the evenings. It was on the fourth night that I first felt something was off. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I got the distinct sensation that someone was watching me. I turned around, half expecting to see Mr. Whiskers perched on the counter, but the room was empty. I shrugged it off, blaming it on being in an unfamiliar house, but the feeling persisted. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, startling at small noises. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just the creaks and settling of an old house. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. Then things started to move. It was smaller. First, a book I could have sworn I left on the coffee table was suddenly on the shelf. The throw pillows on the couch were arranged differently than I remembered. Little things that were easy to dismiss as forgetfulness or the cat's doing. But then I noticed the vase. It was a striking piece, hand-blown glass, and swirls of blue and green. Sarah had it displayed prominently on a side table in the living room. One morning, I walked into the room and stopped short. The vase was now on the mantel above the fireplace. I stood there staring at it, my mind racing. I knew I hadn't moved it. Mr. Whiskers, while mischievous, couldn't possibly have lifted such a heavy piece. For a moment, I wondered if Sarah had come home early and was playing a prank on me. But no, that was ridiculous. She was halfway across Europe. I carefully picked up the vase and returned it to its original spot, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. But over the next few days, I found the vase in a new spot every morning, on the dining room table, in the study, once inexplicably in the bathtub. Each time I would return it to its place, and each time my sense of unease grew. I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night straining to hear any sound of movement in the house, but it was always silent. I thought about calling Sarah, but what would I say? That I thought her house was haunted, that someone was breaking in every night just to move a vase around. I'd sound insane. So I kept quiet, hoping that whatever was happening would stop on its own. It didn't. If anything, it escalated. One night, about 2 weeks into my stay, I woke up to the sound of music playing softly downstairs. It was an old jazz tune, the kind Sarah loved. My heart pounding, I crept down the stairs, a heavy flashlight clutched in my hand as a makeshift weapon. The music was coming from the study. As I approached, I saw a faint light spilling out from under the door. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The old record player in the corner was on the vinyl, spinning silently now that the song had ended. But what made my blood run cold was the chair behind the desk. It was turned to face the door, as if someone had just been sitting there waiting for me. I backed out of the room, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, every creak of the house making me flinch the next morning. In the harsh light of day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd turned on the record player earlier and forgotten about it. Maybe the chair had always been facing that way, and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew better. I started spending as much time out of the house as possible, coming back only to sleep and feed Mr. Whiskers. But even then, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I'd wake up to find my belongings rearranged, doors I'd left open now closed, one standing open. One evening, I came home to find all the photos in the house turned face down, every single one. It took me an hour to go through the rooms, writing each frame with trembling hands as I picked up the last one, a photo of Sarah and me from college. I noticed something that made my heart stop. In the reflection of the glass just over my shoulder, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. I whirled around, but the doorway was empty. I ran through the house, checking every room, but I was alone, or at least visibly alone. That was the last straw. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. I didn't care if Sarah would be upset, or if I sounded crazy. I needed to leave. I was in the bedroom hastily shoving clothes into a bag when I heard it, footsteps slow and deliberate coming up the stairs. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. For a long moment there was only silence. Then slowly the door handle began to turn. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The door swung open, revealing nothing. The hallway beyond was empty. But then, as if drawn by an invisible hand, my suitcase slid across the floor and out into the hall. The door slammed shut with a bang that made me jump. I was trapped. Whatever was in this house, it didn't want me to leave. Panic clawed at my throat as I searched for way out. The window was too high to jump, and my phone had no signal. It hadn't for days. I realized with dawning horror, how had I not noticed that before? As I stood there trying to figure out what to do, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see frost forming on the windows. Then words began to appear in the frost, as if written by an unseen finger. "Stay with us," I screamed. I couldn't help it. The sound tore from my throat, raw and primal. I threw myself at the door, twisting the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I was sure I was about to lose my mind, everything stopped. The room warmed up, the frost disappeared, and the door swung open easily under my hand. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, barely pausing to grab my phone and keys before I was out the front door. And in my car, I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. When I finally stopped somewhere in the next state, I had dozens of missed calls from Sarah. With shaking hands, I called her back. "Oh, thank God," she said. When she answered, "I've been trying to reach you for days. Listen, I need you to get out of the house now." I laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I'm already gone." "Sarah, what the hell is going on in that house?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you before I left the house. It's not normal. Things happen there that I can't explain. I thought maybe it would be different for you then. It was just me. I never should have asked you to stay there. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Would you have believed me? I barely believe it myself. And I've lived there for years. I'm coming home. We'll figure this out. I promise." As I hung up the phone, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a grim determination. Whatever was in that house, and whatever ever had tried to keep me there, it wasn't over. Sarah was coming home, and we were going to get to the bottom of this. But one thing was certain, I was never setting foot in that house again. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some presences once felt leave a mark that never quite fades. The house may have wanted me to stay, but I had chosen to run, and in doing so I may have saved more than just my sanity. I may have saved my soul. The message glowed ominously on my phone screen. "I see you." My heart skipped a beat as I glanced around the empty coffee shop. There was no one here who could have sent this. That's when I realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a wrong number or a prank. Someone was watching me, and they knew far more about me than any stranger should. It started innocently enough, a text from an unknown number asking if I was enjoying my latte. I brushed it off, as a misdial, someone texting the wrong Alex. But then another message came. Through commenting on the book I was reading, my blood ran cold as I realized this person could see me, knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I gathered my things were happening fast. I tried to appear calm as my mind raced. As I stepped out onto the busy street, my phone buzzed again. I was going home so soon, but the day was just beginning. I picked up my pace, weaving through the crowd. My eyes darted around, trying to spot anyone who might be following me. But everyone seemed lost in their own world. No one paid me any particular attention. When I reached my flat, I locked the door behind me. I leaned against it as I tried to catch my breath. Surely here I was safe, I thought, but another message came through. Nice place. I like the blue curtains in your bedroom. My stomach sank. How could they know I had put them there? I leaned against it as I tried to catch my breath. I leaned against it as I tried to catch my breath. Sure, I was safe here. But then another message came through. Nice place. I really like the blue curtains in your bedroom. My stomach sank. How could they know I'd only put them up last week? I ran to the window and yanked the curtain shut, then did the same all over the apartment. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't. Police? But what would I tell them? That I was getting creepy text messages. They'd probably tell me to block the number and forget about it. But I knew this was more than just a random creep. This person knew things about me, things they shouldn't be able to know over. The next few days the messages kept coming. They knew when I left for work, what I ate for lunch, who I talked to. It was like they had access to every aspect of my life. I changed my phone number, but somehow they still found me. I stayed with friends, but the messages followed me. They're too having fun at Sarah's. Tell her I said hi. I became a nervous wreck, jumping at every notification, constantly looking over my shoulder. My friends started to worry, telling me I was being paranoid. But how could I explain to them the terror of knowing someone was watching your every move? After a week of this psychological torture, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't live like this anymore. I messaged back for the first time, "Who are you? What do you want?" The response came almost immediately. "I want you to know how it feels to have your privacy invaded, your life laid bare for someone else's amusement." I stared at the message, confused. What did they mean? Had I done something to deserve this? And then it hit me, a memory from years ago, a stupid mistake I'd made in college. I'd been part of a group that hacked into the school system, accessing private information about other students. We thought it was just a harmless prank, a way to show off our tech skills. But for some of those students, it had been devastating. Relationships had been ruined, reputations damaged. We'd been caught eventually, but I'd managed to avoid any serious consequences. I'd put it behind me, tried to forget about it, but someone hadn't forgotten. Someone had been waiting, planning their revenge. With shaking fingers, I typed out a response. "Jamie, is that you?" The pause before the next message came felt like an eternity. Finally my phone buzzed. "So you do remember?" I'm impressed. Jamie had been one of the students most affected by our hack. He'd left the school shortly after Al, and I'd never known what happened to him. Now I knew he'd been honing his skills, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the tables. "I'm sorry." I typed the words, feeling inadequate even as I sent them. "What we did was wrong. I know that now. Sorry doesn't undo the damage," came the reply. "But it's a start." Over the next hour, Jamie and I messaged back and forth. I learned how he'd been tracking me using a combination of hacked security cameras, GPS data from my phone, and information gleaned from my social media accounts. It was both impressive and terrifying. "Why now?" I asked. "Why wait all these years?" "I needed time." Jamie replied, "Time to learn to plan. And I wanted you to have something to lose, a life you valued, privacy you took for granted." I couldn't argue with that. The past week had shown me exactly how precious privacy was, how vulnerable we all were. What happens now? I asked, dreading the answer. There was a long pause before Jamie's response came through. That depends on you. I could release everything I've gathered, every embarrassing moment, every private conversation. I could destroy your life the way you helped destroy mine. My heart was pounding as I waited for the next message. Or Jamie continued, you could help me help you. How? I asked, not sure. I wanted to know the answer. There are others from our group who never face consequences. And there are people out there right now doing what we did, thinking it's just a game. They need to be stopped. I sat there staring at my phone, my mind reeling. Was Jamie suggesting we become some kind of digital vigilantes? It sounded crazy, dangerous even. But a part of me, the part that had been racked with guilt all these years, saw it as a chance for redemption. If I help you, I typed slowly, will you stop watching me delete everything you've gathered? Yes, came the immediate reply. You have my word. I took a deep breath, knowing that my answer would change my life irrevocably. But hadn't it already been changed? Could I really go back to my normal life pretending this had never happened? Okay, I replied, I'm in good. Jamie responded, check your email. I've sent you instructions for our first target. As I opened my laptop, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. I was stepping into a world I thought I'd left behind, but this time I'd be using my skills to help people, not hurt them. The next few months were a whirlwind. Jamie and I worked together, exposing hackers, shutting down invasion of privacy operations, and educating people about online security. It was challenging, often scary work, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something truly meaningful. True to his word, Jamie deleted all the information he gathered on me. Our relationship evolved from one of fear and resentment to a weary partnership, and eventually to something resembling friendship. Looking back now, I can't help but marvel at how much my life has changed. That first terrifying message, I see you, had set me on a path I never could have imagined. It taught me the true value of privacy, the weight of our actions, and the power of redemption. Now, when I walk down the street or sit in a coffee shop, I no longer feel watched, but I do feel aware of the digital world swirling around us, of the responsibility we all have to protect ourselves and others in this interconnected age. And sometimes, when my phone buzzes with a new message, I still feel a flutter of anxiety, but more often than not, it's just Jamie sending me details of our next mission. Because in this digital age, there's always another wrong to right, another privacy to protect. And thanks to one terrifying week of being watched, I'm now the watcher, the protector, trying to make the online world a little safer for everyone. The moment we pulled into the driveway of that isolated farmhouse, I knew something was terribly wrong. The flicker of movement behind a curtain, the eerie silence that blanketed the property, it all screamed danger. But with our car sputtering its last and night falling fast, we had no choice but to approach. Little did we know we were walking straight into a trap that would test the limits of our survival instincts. It had started as a fun road trip. My girlfriend Lisa and I had been dating for 6 months, and we thought a weekend getaway would be the perfect way to celebrate. We'd chosen a quaint bed and breakfast about 4 hours from the city, nestled in the countryside. The drive had been beautiful, all rolling hills and picturesque farms, but as the sun began to set, things started to go wrong. First, our GPS lost signal, leaving us relying on the spotty directions I remembered from the map. Then the car started making an ominous rattling noise. We pressed on, hoping to make it to our destination before anything serious happened. We didn't make it about an hour from where we thought our BB should be. The car gave a final sputtering gasp and died. We coasted to a stop on the side of a narrow country road surrounded by fields and forests, with no signs of civilization in sight. Great, Lisa sighed, leaning back in her seat. What now? I pulled out my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. I guess we start walking I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. There has to be a house around here somewhere. Maybe they'll have a phone we can use. We grabbed our jackets and a flashlight from the trunk and set off down the road. The sun was sinking fast, casting long shadows across the landscape. An unseasonably cold wind had picked up, and I could feel Lisa shivering beside me. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when we saw a dirt driveway branching off from the main road leading to a large farmhouse set back from the road. Light glowed in a couple of windows, and an old pickup truck was parked out front. It looked like our best hope. As we turned up the driveway, that's when I first felt it, a sense of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. The house looked normal enough, a typical old farmhouse with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch, but something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, but we were cold, tired, and out of options, so we pressed on. We were about halfway up the driveway when I saw the curtain move, just a slight twitch, but enough to tell me someone was watching us approach. I squeezed Lisa's hand, trying to convey reassurance. I didn't feel. We reached the porch steps up by, and I took a deep breath before knocking on the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then slowly, we heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with weathered skin and sharp blue eyes that seemed to look right through us. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. I explained our situation, the broken down car, the lack of cell service, our need to use a phone. As I talked, I noticed the man's eyes flicking between us, assessing it. Made me nervous, but I chalked it up to natural suspicion of strangers. Finally, he nodded. "All right, come on in. Phone's in the kitchen." We stepped inside, and I immediately felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The house smelled musty with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place, but that made my stomach turn. The decor was old-fashioned, but what struck me was how unlived it felt, like a museum exhibit rather than a home. The man who introduced himself as Frank led us to the kitchen. An older woman stood at the sink, her back to us. She turned as we entered, and I had to suppress a gasp. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes as empty as a doll's. "This is my wife, Martha," Frank said. Martha didn't speak, just nodded slightly. Frank pointed to an old rotary phone on the wall. "There you go. You can call for a tow, but it might be a while before they can get out here. Roads can be tricky at night." I thanked him and moved to the phone while Lisa stood awkwardly by the door. As I dialed, I noticed Frank watching me intently. I tried to focus on my conversation with the tow company, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes boring into me. The news wasn't good. The earliest they could get to us was morning. When I hung up and relayed this to Lisa, I saw a flash of fear in her eyes. Frank cleared his throat. "Well, can't have you waiting out in the cold all night. We've got a spare room upstairs. You're welcome to it." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to refuse to get out of this house and taking our chances on the road. But one look at Lisa's pale face, and I knew we didn't have much choice. It was fully dark now, and cold. We had no idea how far it was to the next house. "That's very kind of you," I said, forcing a smile. "We really appreciate it." Frank nodded, a smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. "It's no trouble. We don't get many visitors out here. It'll be nice to have some company." He showed us upstairs to a small bedroom. Like the rest of the house, it felt untouched, as if no one had slept there in years. "Bathrooms down the hall," Frank said. "Sleep tight." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. As soon as he left, Lisa turned to me, her eyes wide. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "Something's not right." I nodded, relieved. She felt it too. "I know, but we don't have many options right now. Let's just try to get through the night. We'll leave first thing in the morning." We laid down on the bed, fully clothed, too nervous to change or get under the covers. Neither of us slept. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind outside the window had us on edge. It was just past midnight when we heard its footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. They paused outside our door. I held my breath, my arm tightening around Lisa. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on. We need to get out of here, Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded. Okay, let's go. Quietly, we crept to the door, easing it open. The hallway was dark, but I could make out the stairs at the end. We tiptoed towards them, every floorboard creak sounding like a gunshot in the silence. We were halfway down the stairs when a floorboard let out a particularly loud groan. Suddenly a light flicked on downstairs, going somewhere. Frank's voice called out, abandoning all pretense of stealth. We ran. We burst out the front door and into the cold night air. But as we reached the bottom of the porch steps, we realized our mistake. We had no idea which way. LED back to the main road. This way, I said, choosing a direction and pulling Lisa along. We ran across the overgrown yard, the tall grass whipping at our legs. Behind us, I could hear Frank's voice calling out in a sing-song tone that made my blood run cold. Now, don't be rude, the fun's just getting started. We reached the edge of a cornfield and plunged in the dry stalk, scratching at our faces as we pushed through. I could hear movement behind us, Frank crashing through the corn in pursuit. We ran until our lungs burned, until I thought my heart might burst from my chest. Finally, we broke free of the cornfield and found ourselves on a dirt road. In the distance, I could see lights, a house, or maybe a gas station. Come on, I gasped, pulling Lisa towards the lights behind us. I could hear Frank's angry shouts growing fainter. We stumbled into the parking lot of a small gas station, startling the attendant inside. He took one look at our wild eyes and scratched at faces and reached for the phone. The police arrived quickly. As we sat in the back of a patrol car wrapped in shock blankets, I watched more cars pull up, heading in the direction of Frank's farm. An officer took our statement, his face growing grimmer with each detail we shared. It wasn't until later, after we'd been checked out at a hospital and given a place to rest, that we learned the truth. The farm had belonged to Frank and Martha for decades, but Martha had died years ago. Frank had suffered a breakdown, unable to let her go. The woman we'd seen wasn't Martha, but one of several missing persons Frank had abducted over the years, trying to recreate his lost wife. The police found evidence of other victims on the property. Frank was arrested, and the woman we thought was Martha was rescued, along with 2 others held in the basement. In the days and weeks that followed, as we gave statements and tried to process what had happened, one thought kept running through my mind: how close we'd come to becoming just another missing persons case, another victim of a madman's delusion. Lisa and I stayed together, bonded by our shared trauma, but we never took another road trip. Sometimes, when I'm driving down a dark road at night and I see a lonely farmhouse in the distance, I feel that same chill I felt at night. And I keep driving, never stopping, always wary of the secrets that might be hiding behind a seemingly innocent facade. The scratching sound came again, faint but unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from inside my closet. I was alone in my apartment, and that closet door had been firmly shut when I went to bed. When whatever was in there now hadn't come through the front door, I'd always been a light sleeper, which is probably what saved my life. That night the sound was so soft at first that I thought I might have dreamed it, but as I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears, I heard it again, a light scraping like fingernails on wood coming from the direction of my bedroom closet. My first thought was that it must be a mouse. The building was old, and I'd heard other tenants complain about rodents before. But as I listened, the sound became more deliberate, more rhythmic. This wasn't the random scurrying of a small animal. This was something else entirely. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hand shaking so badly I nearly knocked it to the floor. The bright screen made me squint as I pulled up the camera app, switching it to video mode. If there was something in my closet, I wanted proof. Slowly, I sat up in bed, keeping my eyes fixed on the closet door. The scratching had stopped, but now I could hear something else breathing slow and steady, like someone trying very hard to be quiet. My heart was pounding so hard. I was sure whatever was in there must be able to hear it. I wanted to run, to bolt out of my apartment and never look back, but a morbid curiosity kept me rooted in place. I had to know what was in there. With my phone held out in front of me, I eased out of bed. The floor creaked under my feet, and I froze, waiting. The breathing in the closet hitched for a moment, then resumed its steady rhythm, step by agonizing step. I made my way across the room. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As I got closer, I could smell something, a musty odor like old sweat, and something vaguely metallic. I was an arm's length from the closet now. My free hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then, in one swift motion, I yanked the door open. The smell hit me first, stronger now. Then my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the closet, and I saw it, a figure crouched in the back corner, partially hidden behind my hanging clothes. It was humanoid, but in the dim light, something about its proportions seemed off. For a moment, we both froze, staring at each other. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible, it lunged at me. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. The creature person fell forward onto the bedroom floor. In the light from my phone, I could see it clearly now. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken and wild. He was emaciated, his clothes hanging off him in tatters. But what struck me most were his hands. His fingers were unnaturally long, the nails grown into thick yellowed claws. These were what had made the scratching sound. He scrabbled to his feet, those terrible hands reaching for me. I turned and ran, my phone clattering to the floor behind me. I heard it shatter, plunging the room into darkness. I made it to the living room, my mind racing. The front door was just a few feet away. If I could get out, call for help, but I never made it. Something hit me from behind, sending me sprawling onto the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and before I could recover, I felt those claw-like hands on my shoulders, flipping me over. The man-creature, whatever it was, loomed over me up close. I could see that his teeth were filed to points. He grinned down at me, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. He whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. I've been waiting so long to meet you. I opened my mouth to scream, but he clamped one of those terrible hands over my face. The smell of him was overwhelming, and I felt myself starting to black out. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was his voice whispering in my ear, "We're going to have so much fun together." When I came to, I was no longer in my apartment. The air was damp and cool, and I could hear water dripping somewhere nearby. I tried to move, but found my hands and feet were bound tightly. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was in some kind of underground chamber. The walls were rough stone, and the only illumination came from a few candles placed around the room. I wasn't alone. There were others, at least 3, that I could see similarly bound. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. One, a woman who might have been in her 30s, shook her head slightly when she saw me looking at her, as if to say, "Don't bother trying to escape." I heard movement from the shadows, and then he appeared, the creature from my closet. In this light, he looked even less human. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. "Oh, you're awake," he said, that terrible grin spreading across his face. "Again, good. It's no fun when they sleep through everything." I tried to speak, but my mouth was so dry no words would come out. He seemed to understand. "Though you're wondering why you're here, why I chose you." He crouched down next to me, his face uncomfortably close to mine. "I've been watching you for a long time, all of you, waiting for the perfect moment." He stood up and began pacing the room, his claws clicking against the stone floor. "You see, I need you. Your fear, your pain, it sustains me, keeps me young." He gestured to the other captives. "They've all contributed but it's never enough, I always need more. As he spoke, I noticed something strange. His appearance seemed to be changing. The more he talked, the less monstrous he looked. His skin took on a healthier color. His frame filled out. Even his hands were changing, the claws receding. With growing horror, I realized what he was saying was literally true. He was feeding off our fear, our suffering. It was physically transforming him. What are you?" I managed to croak out. He paused in his pacing, turning to look at me with those wild eyes. "I've had many names over the centuries: vampire, wendigo, boogeyman. But names don't really matter, do they? What matters is what I can do." He knelt down beside me again, running one of those terrible hands through my hair in a parody of a gentle caress. "And what I can do, my dear, is live forever, as long as I have souls like yours to feed on." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will this all away. This couldn't be real. Monsters like this didn't exist. Any moment now, I'd wake up in my bed, and this would all have been a terrible nightmare. But when I opened my eyes, I was still there, still bound in that damp underground chamber, still at the mercy of this creature that defied explanation. He must have seen the despair in my eyes, because he laughed. It was a horrible sound, like rocks grinding together. "Oh, don't look so sad. You should be honored. Your fear, your suffering, it will become part of me. In a way, you'll live forever too." With that, he stood and moved to one of the other captives, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20. What happened next, I can barely bring myself to describe. The screams echoed off the stone walls, mixing with the creature's laughter. I don't know how long I was in that place. Time lost all meaning. Day and night blurred together in an endless cycle of terror and pain. I watched as one by one the other captives were consumed, is the only word I can think of. Their fear, their very essence, absorbed by this monster. And all the while he changed with each victim. He became more human in appearance. By the time he turned his attention fully to me, he could have passed for a normal man on the street. I'd like to say I was brave in the face of what I knew was coming, that I defied him to the end. But the truth is, I was broken when he finally approached me, that familiar terrible grin on his now handsome face. I didn't fight, I didn't scream, I just closed my eyes and waited for it to be over. But something strange happened just as I felt his hands on me. There was a commotion from above, shouts, the sound of splintering. With the creature's head snapped up, his eyes wide with an emotion I hadn't seen from him before. Fear. What happened next is a blur in my memory. There were people in uniforms, bright lights, and loud voices. I remember being carried out of that underground hell, seeing sunlight for the first time in what felt like years. I later learned that a neighbor had called the police after hearing strange noises from my apartment. On the night I was taken, it had taken them weeks to track us down, following a trail of similar disappearances across the country. They never found the creature. In the chaos of the raid, he had somehow slipped away. The police assured me he couldn't have gotten far, that they would find him. But I knew better. He had been doing this for centuries. He would go to ground, wait until the hunt died down, and then he would start again, sometimes late at night. I still hear that scratching sound. I know it's just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. But I can't help but wonder, is he out there watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? And I realized that in a way he was right. A part of me will live forever, the part that will always be looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale scratch in the night. Because I know the truth now, monsters are real, and sometimes they look just like us. The moment I stumbled upon the hidden compound in the forest, I knew I discovered something I was never meant to see. The air grew thick with tension, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized that my life was about to change forever if I managed to survive the next few hours. I've always been an avid hiker, spending most of my weekends exploring the vast wilderness near my home. This particular Saturday started like any other. I packed my usual gear: water, snacks, first aid kit, and set out at dawn, eager to tackle a new trail I'd recently discovered on an old map. The trail was more overgrown than I expected, barely visible in some places, but I pressed on, enjoying the challenge and the sense of being truly off the beaten path. It was nearing midday when I realized I'd strayed from the trail entirely. I wasn't particularly worried. I had my compass and knew the general direction back to my car, so I decided to press on a bit further before turning back, curious to see what lay beyond the next ridge. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glint of metal through the trees, so out of place in the dense forest that I thought I must be imagining things. But as I moved closer, ducking under LWH hanging branches and pushing through thick underbrush, I realized I wasn't seeing things there. Nestled in a small valley was a compound, high metal fences topped with barbed wire encircled a cluster of nondescript buildings. The structures were low and gray with few windows. They could have been warehouses or barracks. What struck me most was how new everything looked. This wasn't some long abandoned military installation or forgotten research station. This place was active and clearly not meant to be found. I crouched behind a large fallen tree, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There were people moving around inside the compound, dressed in what looked like uniforms, but I was too far away to make out any details. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should take a picture, but of course there was no signal this deep in the woods. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping behind me. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat. There, not 10 feet away, stood a man in camouflage, a rifle pointed directly at my chest. "Don't move," he said, his voice low and steady. "Hands where I can see them." I raised my hand slowly, my mind racing. Who were these people? What was this place? And more pressingly, what were they going to do with me? The man spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder. "BS, this is Patrol 2. We have an intruder at the north perimeter, bringing him in." My stomach dropped at those words. Bringing him in? This was bad, very bad. "Stand up slowly," the man ordered. I complied, my legs shaky beneath me. "Now walk, and don't try anything stupid." He marched me down the hill towards the compound. As we got closer, I could see more details. The fence was at least 15 feet high with cameras placed at regular intervals. A gate slid open as we approached, and 2 more armed men came out to meet us. "Where did you find him?" one of them asked my captor. "Up on the ridge." He was watching the compound. The 2 newcomers exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. Without another word, they grabbed my arms and led me into the compound. Inside was a flurry of activity. People in lab coats rushed between buildings carrying folders and equipment. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and everywhere there was an air of urgency, as if everyone was working against some unseen clock. I was led to one of the larger buildings and taken inside. The interior was stark and clinical, reminiscent of a hospital, but with an underlying sense of menace. They brought me to a small windowless room and ordered me to sit in a metal chair bolted to the floor for what felt like hours. I sat there alone, my mind conjuring up increasingly terrifying scenarios. Were they going to kill me, imprison me? What was this place? And what were they doing here that required such secrecy? Finally, the door opened. A woman entered, her sharp features accentuated by her severely pulled back hair. She sat across from me, placing a folder on the table between us. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice clipped and businesslike. "And what are you doing here?" I explained about my hike, how I'd gotten lost and stumbled upon the compound by accident. As I talked, she watched me with an unnerving intensity, as if trying to peer into my very thoughts. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. "It was me on the ridge, taken just before I was captured. You understand," she said, "that this puts us in a very difficult position. You've seen things you were never meant to see." I swallowed hard. "I don't know what this place is. And honestly, I don't want to know." If you just let me go, I swear I won't tell anyone about this. I'll forget I ever saw anything." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, what we're doing here, it's bigger than you can imagine, bigger than all of us. We can't risk exposure, not when we're so close to what." The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. She stood up abruptly. "That's not your concern. What you need to concern yourself with now is cooperation. The more you cooperate, the easier this will be for you." With that, she left, leaving me alone with my growing fear and confusion. Over the next few days, at least I think it was days, it was hard to keep track of time in that windowless room. I was questioned repeatedly. They wanted to know everything about me, my job, my family, my friends. They were particularly interested in whether I told anyone about my hiking plans. In between interrogations, I caught glimpses and overheard snippets that only deepened the mystery. I heard mentions of the subject and the breakthrough. Once I saw a group of scientists rushing a covered gurney between buildings, an inhuman scream emerging from beneath the sheep. On what I think was the third day, everything changed. I was woken in the middle of the night by alarms blaring throughout the compound. Through my door, I could hear shouting and the sound of running feet. Suddenly my door burst open. It was one of the guards, but he looked terrified. "We have to go," he said, grabbing my arm. "It's loose." "What's loose?" I asked as he dragged me into the hallway, but I didn't need him to answer. Down the corridor, I saw it, a creature that defied description, part animal, part something else. It moved with unnatural speed, lashing out with claws and teeth at anyone in its path. The guard pulled me in the opposite direction toward an emergency exit. We burst out into the night air, alarms still blaring behind us. The compound was in chaos. Fires had broken out in several buildings, and I could hear gunfire and screams. "Run!" the guard yelled, pushing me toward the perimeter fence. "There's a break in the fence about half a mile east. Get out of here and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, my lungs burning, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of destruction growing fainter, but I didn't slow down. I found the brack in the fence and squeezed through, ignoring the sting as the wire caught and tore at my clothes and skin. Once on the other side, I kept running, not caring about direction, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that nightmare as possible. It was nearly dawn when I finally stopped, collapsing against a tree. My body pushed well past its limits as I sat there gasping for breath. The full weight of what I'd witnessed came crashing down on me. I had stumbled upon something beyond my wildest imagination, a secret facility hidden in the woods where they were doing what, creating monsters, experimenting with things that should never see the light of day. And now it had all gone horribly wrong. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I couldn't just disappear, couldn't let what I'd seen remain a secret. Whatever was going on in that compound, whatever had escaped, the world needed to know. With shaky legs, I stood and began walking. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I knew I had to find my way back to civilization. I had a story to tell, a warning to give, and I knew that from this moment on my life would never be the same. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Was it just paranoia after what I'd been through, or was something out there following me, waiting for the right moment to strike? I quickened my pace, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger, much more terrifying story. And somehow, against all odds, I had become a part of it. The first thing I noticed when I regained consciousness was the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a lazy Sunday morning, but an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound that made my skin crawl as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. Panic set in. This wasn't my bedroom. I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there, but the note on the door made one thing terrifyingly clear. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't leave this room. My head was pounding, and my mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I tried to piece together my last memories, I'd been at a bar celebrating my promotion with colleagues. There had been drinks, lots of them. Someone had suggested moving the party to a club. After that, everything was a blur. I sat up slowly, fighting a wave of nausea. I was on a bare mattress in what looked like a small studio apartment. There was a kitchenette in one corner, a door that presumably led to a bathroom, and the main door with the ominous note. The windows were boarded up, allowing only slivers of light to penetrate the gloom. Stumbling to my feet, I made my way to the main door. The note was handwritten, the letters jagged and rushed. Don't try to leave, stay inside if you want to live. I stared at those words, reading them over and over, trying to make sense of them. Was this some kind of sick joke, a prank gone too far? I tried the door handle, locked of course. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the thick wood seemed to swallow my cries. After what felt like hours, my voice hoarse and my hands bruised, I gave up. The bathroom door at least was unlocked. I splashed water on my face, the cold shock helping to clear my head. As I looked in the mirror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small puncture mark on my neck, surrounded by a bruise. I'd been injected with something. That realization sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I tore through the apartment, searching for my phone, my wallet, anything that might help me figure out what was going on or call for help, but all my belongings were gone. The kitchenette was stocked with non-perishable food and bottled water, enough to last for weeks if I rationed it carefully. The cupboards also contained basic medical supplies and some clothes that looked like they would fit me. Whoever had put me here had planned for a long stay. As the initial shock wore off, my mind raced with questions. Who had done this? Why me? And what was outside the door that was so dangerous? I needed to be warned not to leave. I spent that first day alternating between trying to find a way out and straining my ears for any sound from outside, but the silence remained unbroken, and every potential escape route led to a dead end. The windows were not only boarded, but seemed to be bricked up behind the boards. The vents were too small for even a child to crawl through. I was well and truly trapped. Night fell, or at least I assumed it did. It was hard to tell. With no view of the outside world, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something creeping into the room. Instead, I sat with my back against the wall, staring at the door, waiting. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. I tried to keep track of time, but with no sunlight, no clocks, the hours blurred together. I rationed the food and water, not knowing how long I'd need to make it last. I exercised to keep my mind occupied, paced the small space until I had memorized every crack in the walls. On what I thought was the fourth day, I heard it, a sound from outside, faint at first, but growing louder. Footsteps. My heart raced as they approached the door, then a soft thud as something was placed outside them. Footsteps retreated. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours before I dared to approach the door. There was no mail slot, no way to see what had been left. But now there was a new note: food and water. Outside, wait 30 minutes after delivery before opening. Door close immediately. Do not attempt to leave or make contact. My hands shook as I read the note. This was my chance. I could open the door, maybe see who had put me here, find a way to escape. But the warning on the first note echoed in my mind: stay inside if you want to live. I waited, counting the seconds, worrying with myself over what to do. When 30 minutes had passed, I took a deep breath and turned the handle. It was unlocked. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into a dimly lit hallway. There was a box on the floor filled with more food and water, but what caught my eye was the wall opposite my door. It was covered in newspaper clippings and photographs. In the brief moment before I lost my nerve and slammed the door shut, one headline burned itself into my brain: outbreak spreads, major cities quarantine. My mind reeled. Outbreak, quarantine. Was that why I was locked in here? But why me why like this? The food and water law lasted another week. Each day I became more desperate for information, for human contact, for anything to break the maddening silence and isolation. I started talking to myself, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions just to hear a voice. Then on the 10th day, or was it the 11th, everything changed. I woke to the sound of alarms blaring, harsh mechanical wails that cut through the silence like a knife. For a moment, I was elated. Sound, action, maybe rescue. But then I heard something else, screams, distant at first, but growing closer, and underneath the screams another sound, a low guttural growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. The door handle began to rattle violently. Something was trying to get in. No, not something, someone. I could hear them now, their labored breathing, their fists pounding on the wood. Let me in, a voice cried, hoarse with fear. Please, they're coming. I stood frozen, torn between the instinct to help and the warnings that had been drilled into me over the past days. The pounding grew more frantic. Please, I can see you in there, let me. And how could they see me? I hadn't moved near the door. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, not anymore. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet, tearing sound and a scream that cut off mid-cry. Then silence again, but not the same silence as before. This was the silence of a predator stalking its prey. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard. I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. I retreated to the bathroom, locking the flimsy door behind me, knowing it wouldn't provide much protection if something really wanted to get in. Hours passed. The alarms eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I strained my ears for any sound, any clue as to what was happening outside. Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense any longer, I heard it, footsteps in the hallway again, but different this time. Time measured, deliberate. They stopped outside my door. Hello, a voice called. We're here to evacuate the building. If you can hear me, please respond. I wanted to cry out, to rush to the door, but doubt nagged at me. What if it was a trick? What if opening that door meant death? This is your last chance, the voice said. We're leaving in 5 minutes. If you can hear this, knock 3 times on the door. I stood, my legs shaking. This was at the moment of truth. Stay and face an uncertain fate alone in this room, or risk everything on the hope that salvation waited on the other side of that door. As I raised my hand to knock, a chilling thought struck me. In all the days I'd been here, through all the silence and isolation, I'd never once questioned why I had been chosen to be saved, what made me special, and more importantly, what price would I have to pay for that salvation. My knuckles hovered inches from the door as the seconds ticked by. 3 knocks stood between me and whatever awaited on the other side. 3 knocks to either save my life or end it. As I steeled myself to make my choice, I realized that the real test wasn't surviving this room. The real test was what I would do once I left it. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the back of my throat and made my stomach churn as I stood in Mr. Johnson's living room, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and unwashed dishes. I knew something was terribly wrong. My elderly neighbor hadn't been seen in days, but nothing could have prepared me for the horror I was about to uncover. I'd lived next door to Mr. Johnson for nearly 5 years. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but always had a kind word and a wave when we crossed paths. He was the type of neighbor you'd expect in a small town like ours, unobtrusive but reliable. If his lawn got a bit overgrown or his mailbox started overflowing, someone would always notice and check in on him. That's why his sudden absence was so unsettling. It started on a Tuesday. I was leaving for work and noticed his newspaper was still on the driveway. Odd, I thought, but maybe he'd slept in by Thursday. There were 3 papers piled up, and his car hadn't moved from its spot in the driveway. I knocked on his door that evening, but there was no answer. The curtains were drawn and I couldn't hear any movement inside. A sick feeling started to grow in the pit of my stomach. Mr. Johnson was in his 80s. What if he'd fallen and couldn't get to the phone? I debated calling the police, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he'd gone to visit family and forgotten to tell anyone. It happens sometimes with older folks. Instead, I decided to use the spare key he'd given me for emergencies and check on him myself. The lock turned easily, but the door stuck as I tried to open it. I had to put my shoulder into it, and when it finally gave way, I nearly gagged. The smell that wafted out was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and something else I couldn't quite place, but that sent shivers down my spine. Mr. Johnson, I called out, my voice sounding small and afraid in the stuffy silence of the house. It's Sarah from next door. Are you all right? No answer. I stepped further into the house, made my eyes watering from the stench. The living room was a mess unlike anything I had seen in Mr. Johnson's usually tidy home. Newspapers were stacked haphazard on every surface, some yellowed with age. Dirty plates and half-empty cups littered the coffee table and floor, but it was the walls that really caught my attention. They were covered in writing, scrawled messages in what looked like red marker. As I got closer, my blood ran cold. The writing was erratic, almost frenzied, and the messages were disturbing. They're watching, can't trust anyone. The signals are getting stronger. I pulled out my phone, ready to call 911, when I heard a noise from upstairs, a soft thud, like something heavy falling over Mr. Johnson. I called again, louder this time. Is that you? Silence. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of this house and call the police. But what if Mr. Johnson was hurt? What if he needed help right now? With shaking legs, I made my way up the stairs. The smell grew stronger with each step, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from retching. At the top of the stairs, I saw that the door to Mr. Johnson's bedroom was ajar. A faint light spilled out into the hallway. Mr. Johnson, I said, pushing the door open slowly. I'm coming in. Okay. The bedroom was even worse than downstairs. The walls were completely covered in the same frantic writing, but here it wasn't just markers. Some of it looked like it had been scratched into the wallpaper with fingernails. And there in the center of the room was Mr. Johnson. He was sitting in an old armchair facing away from me. I could see the top of his balding head over the back of the chair. Mr. Johnson, my voice was barely a whisper now. Are you all right? I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it, a dark stain on the carpet spreading out from beneath the chair. My mind didn't want to process what I was seeing, but I knew. Oh God, I knew. I circled around to the front of the chair, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Mr. Johnson's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. In his lap was a notebook open to a page filled with more of the frenzied writing, and in his hand, gripped so tightly his knuckles were white, was a kitchen knife. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. Mr. Johnson was the sweetest old man. He baked cookies for the neighborhood kids and fed stray cats. He wouldn't have, but the evidence was right in front of me. Mr. Johnson had taken his own life, surrounded by the ravings of a mind that had clearly slipped into paranoia and delusion. With trembling hands, I finally managed to dial 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't help but look around the room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The writing on the wall seemed to be a mix of conspiracy theories and personal paranoia. There were references to government mind control, alien invasions, and shadowy organizations watching his every move. But interspersed with these were more personal messages. Sarah next door is one of them. Can't trust the mailman. He's bringing their signals. The TV is how they get into your head. Seeing my name there sent a chill through me. How long had Mr. Johnson been suspicious of me? Had he been watching me, thinking I was part of some sinister plot? The police Polly arrived, filling the house with noise and activity that felt Surreal after the oppressive silence, I gave my statement in a daze, watching as they photographed the scene and bagged evidence. It wasn't until much later, after I'd been questioned and sent home, that the full impact of what I'd seen hit me. I sat on my couch staring at the wall that separated my house from Mr. Johnson's, and I broke down. How had I not noticed? How had none of us seen that Mr. Johnson was struggling so badly? There must have been signs, changes in his behavior or appearance that we'd all missed or dismissed. The next few weeks were a blur of police investigations and neighborhood gossip. Mr. Johnson had no family, so the task of cleaning out his house fell to the county. I watched from my window as workers in hazmat suits went in and out carrying boxes and furniture. One day, as I was bringing in my mail, one of the workers approached me. He held out a sealed envelope. "We found this in the house," he said. "It's addressed to you," with shaking hands. I took the envelope. My name was written on it in Mr. Johnson's familiar scroll. I waited until the worker had gone before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same frenzied writing I'd seen in the house. But this message was different. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then they got to me. I'm sorry for what you must have seen. I want you to know that it wasn't your fault. You were kind to me even when I started to lose my grip on reality. I know now that the voices in my head weren't real, that the conspiracies were just delusions. But by the time I realized this, it was too late. The paranoia had taken over. Please don't blame yourself. You were a good neighbor and a good friend. I'm sorry I couldn't be the same for you. Take care of yourself, Sarah, and always keep an eye out for those who might be struggling in silence. Arthur Johnson." I read the letter over and over, tears streaming down my face. The guilt I'd been carrying eased a little, but a new weight settled in its place. How many others were out there like Mr. Johnson, fighting battles we couldn't see? In the months that followed, I made an effort to really connect with my neighbors, not just the polite waves and small talk, but real conversations. I organized a neighborhood watch program, not to look for criminals, but to look out for each other. Mr. Johnson's house stood empty for a long time. Eventually, it was sold to a young family. I watched them move in, full of excitement for their new home, and I felt a pang of sadness mixed with hope. As I went to introduce myself to my new neighbors, I made a silent promise to Mr. Johnson. I would never again let someone suffer in silence. If I could help it, his tragic end had opened my eyes to the hidden struggles people face, and I was determined to make a difference, one neighbor at a time. The memory of that horrible day will stay with me forever. The smell, the writing on the walls, the sight of Mr. Johnson in that chair. These things haunt my dreams, but they also drive me to be more aware, more compassionate, and more involved in my community, because sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the monsters under our beds or the bumps in the night. Sometimes the real horror is the quiet suffering of those around us, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. And the only way to fight that horror is with kindness, attention, and a willingness to reach out even when it's uncomfortable or scary. Mr. Johnson's story ended in tragedy, but it taught me a lesson I'll never forget. We're all responsible for each other in ways big and small, and sometimes a simple act of noticing, of caring, can make all the difference in the world. The moment I saw them pull into the parking lot, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary night shift. There was something off about the way they moved, the way they watched the station as the hours ticked by, and they showed no signs of leaving. A knot of dread began to form in the pit of my stomach. Little did I know I was about to experience the longest and most terrifying night of my life. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Pete's Gas and Go for about 6 months. It was a small station on the outskirts of town, just off the highway. Most nights were quiet, a few truckers stopping for coffee, Maybe some rowdy teenagers buying snacks on their way home from a party. Nothing I couldn't handle that night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m. Relieving the evening guy Mike, we did our usual handover, counting the till, checking inventory, the usual small talk. Quiet night? I asked, stifling a yawn. Mike nodded, yet dead as a doornail, though he hesitated, glancing out the window. There's been a car sitting across the street for a couple hours now, probably nothing, but keep an eye out. Yeah, I followed his gaze. Sure enough, there was an old sedan parked on the shoulder, its headlights off. I couldn't make out anyone inside from this distance. Thanks for the heads up, I said, trying to ignore the slight unease his words had caused. I'm sure it's just someone having car trouble or something. Mike left, and I settled in for my shift. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. A trucker came in for coffee. A couple filled up their RV. Nothing out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, that car was still there. It was around 2 a.m. when they finally made their move. 3 men got out of the car and walked towards the station. Even from a distance, I could tell something was off. Their movements were too deliberate, too coordinated. This wasn't a group of friends stopping for snacks. As they got closer, I could see them more clearly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot. They were all wearing dark clothes and caps pulled low over their faces. The one in front was tall and lanky with a sharp, angular face. The other two were stockier, moving with a kind of coiled tension that set my nerves on edge. I quickly ran through my options. The panic button was under the counter, but if I hit it now, they'd know something was up before they even entered the store. My phone was in my bag in the back room. The only other person around was Earl, the old security guard who patrolled the lot, but he was more likely to fall asleep in his car than be of any real help. The bell over the door chimed as they entered up close. They looked even more menacing. The tall one, clearly the leader, flashed me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Evening, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. Nice night, isn't it? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hand inched towards the panic button. I wouldn't do that if I were you, the leader said, his eyes flicking to my hand. Things will go a lot smoother if you just cooperate. One of the others pulled out a gun, pointing it casually in my direction. My blood ran cold. Open the register, the leader commanded, all pretense of friendliness gone. And don't try anything stupid with shaking hands. I complied as I was emptying the cash into a bag they'd provided. I heard the bell chime again. My heart sank as I saw poor old Earl waddle and completely oblivious to the situation. Hey there, Jimmy, he called out cheerfully, just stopping in for my usual. He froze as he took in the scene. The gunman swung around, pointing the weapon at Earl. Don't move, old man, he growled. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Earl, bless his heart, tried to be a hero. He reached for the taser he carried, but never used it. Gunman, startled by the sudden movement, fired. The sound was deafening. In the small space, Earl crumpled to the ground, a red stain blooming on his shirt. I heard someone screaming and realized it was me. Shut up, the leader hissed, grabbing my arm and shaking me roughly. You want to join him? I shook my head mutely, tears streaming down my face. Earl was still moving, groaning softly. He needed help, but there was nothing I could do. We need to get out of here, one of the men said, his voice tight with panic. Someone must have heard that shot. The leader nodded. Grab the money, you. He turned to me. You're coming with us. Insurance. They dragged me out of the store, leaving Earl bleeding on the floor. I was numb with shock and fear as they shoved me into the back seat of their car. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of flashing lights in the distance. Help was coming, but too late for me. We drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and my muffled sobs. Finally, we turned onto a dirt road, driving deep into the woods before coming to a stop in front of a dilapidated cabin. Home sweet home, the leader said with a humorless laugh. At least for now. They marched me inside. The cabin was bare except for a few folding chairs and a table covered in maps and papers. They tied me to one of the chairs, none too gently. What are you going to do with me? I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. The leader shrugged. Haven't decided yet. Depends on how much heat we've got on us. For now, you're our insurance policy. As the night wore on, their nerves began to fray. They argued in hushed voices, casting frequent glances my way. I caught snippets of their conversation, something about a bigger job gone wrong, someone named Rodriguez who had screwed them over. It was clear this gas station robbery had been a desperate move, not their original plan. I must have dozed off at some point because I was jolted awake by the sound of a phone ringing. The leader answered it, his face growing darker as he listened. We've got a problem, he said. After hanging up, cops found our car. They're setting up roadblocks. The other two exploded in a flurry of curses and accusations. As they argued, I noticed something that made my heart race. In their agitation, they'd left the cabin door slightly ajar. Beyond it, I could see the first faint light of dawn filtering through the trees. Making a split-second decision, I started rocking my chair. The ropes were tight, but the chair was old and rickety. With each I felt it loosen. The men were too engrossed in their argument to notice at first. By the time they realized what I was doing, it was too late. With a final heave, I toppled backwards. The chair splintered beneath me. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain from the fall and the ropes cutting my skin. I ran for the door. Adrenaline gave me speed I didn't know I had. I ran for the door, adrenaline giving me speed I didn't know I had. I heard screams behind me. Then the bark of a tree exploded near my head. But I didn't stop running blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was that I had to keep going, had to find help. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled onto a road. In the distance, I could see a car approaching, summoning the last of my strength. I waved my arms frantically. The car slowed them. Stopped. It was a police cruiser. As the officer got out, concern etched on his face. I finally let myself believe that I was safe. The aftermath was a blur of police statements, hospital visits, and questions from reporters. The three men were caught trying to hijack a car a few miles from the cabin. Earl thankfully had survived, though he'd need months of recovery. As for me, I quit my job at the gas station. I couldn't bear the thought of working nights again, a feeling that vulnerable. It took months of therapy before I could sleep through the night without nightmares. But slowly I began to heal. I realized that surviving that night had given me a strength I never knew I had. I went back to school, started volunteering at a crisis center. I wanted to help others who had been through trauma, to show them that there was life on the other side of fear. Now, years later, I still sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of gunshots ringing in my ears. But then I take a deep breath, remind myself that I'm safe, that I survived, and in those moments I'm grateful for every boring, ordinary day, because I know firsthand how quickly an ordinary night can turn into a nightmare. That night at the gas station changed me forever. It showed me the worst of humanity, but also the strength within myself. And while I would never wish that experience on anyone, I can't deny that it shaped me into the person I am today. A survivor, a fighter, someone who knows the value of every moment of peace and safety. So if you ever find yourself working a lonely night shift, stay alert, trust your instincts, and remember, even in the darkest moments, there's always hope, because sometimes the difference between being a victim and a survivor is just one moment of courage. The first twig snap could have been a deer, the second maybe a raccoon, but when I heard the third followed by a low guttural growl, I knew we were in serious trouble. Our family camping trip had just turned into a fight for survival. and the predators circling our campsite were unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My wife and Sarah and I had been planning this camping trip with our two kids, Ethan 11 and Lily 7, for months. We found a secluded spot deep in the national forest, far from the crowded campgrounds and RV parks, just us, the trees, and the stars. Or so we thought. The first day had been perfect. We'd hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and roasted marshmallows over the campfire. The kids were thrilled to be away from their iPads and video games, rediscovering the simple joys of the outdoors. As night fell, and we tucked them into their sleeping bags at our family tent, Sarah and I shared a smile. This was exactly what we'd hoped for, but sometime in the early hours of the morning I woke with a start. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. No chirping crickets, no hooting owls, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Then I heard it, a rustling outside the tent, too deliberate to be the wind. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, closer this time. And then, that first snap of a twig. I nudged Sarah awake, pressing a finger to my lips. When she started to speak, she must have seen the concern in my eyes, because she immediately tensed, listening intently. When the second twig snapped, her eyes widened in fear. Wake the kids, I whispered, reaching for the flashlight we kept by our sleeping bags. Quietly, as Sarah gently roused Ethan and Lily, trying to keep them calm, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The campsite was bathed in silvery moonlight, shadows stretching long and dark between the trees. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush at the edge of our campsite, something that walked on four legs, but was far too big to be any normal forest animal. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, it turned its head towards our tent. A pair of eyes reflected the moonlight, glowing an unnatural green. That's when I heard the growl, low and menacing, and much too close for comfort. We need to move, I said, trying to keep my voice steady for the kids. I'm safe now. What is it, Dad? Ethan asked, his voice small and frightened. I'm not sure, buddy, I replied, but we're not going to stick around to find out. Everyone grab your shoes and a jacket, leave everything else. As we hurriedly laced up our hiking boots, I ran through our options. The car was parked about a mile down the trail. Under normal circumstances, an easy walk, but in the dark, with who knows what stalking us, it would be risky. There was a ranger station marked on our trail map in the opposite direction from the car. It was further, maybe 5 miles, but it would have a radio weapon, someone who might know what we were dealing with. Okay, listen up, I said, gathering my family close. We're going to head to the ranger station. It's a bit of a hike, but we'll be safer there. Ethan, I need you to help Lily. Sarah, you lead the way, I'll bring up the rear. I handed Sarah the map and compass. She was always better with directions than me. Then I picked up the hatchet we brought for chopping firewood. It felt pathetically inadequate against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. As we emerged from the tent, the growling intensified. I could see shapes moving in the darkness, now circling our campsite. 3, maybe 4 of them, large wolf-like, but wrong somehow. Their movements were too fluid, too intelligent. Run, I shouted, as one of the creatures suddenly bounded forward. We took off down the trail, the beam of our flashlight bouncing wildly. As we ran, I could hear the creatures crashing through the underbrush behind us, their growls turning into high-pitched howls that made my blood run cold. Lily stumbled, and I scooped her up without breaking stride, my muscles protesting under her weight. Ethan was right behind Sarah, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Don't look back, I called out. Just keep moving. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The sounds of pursuit faded in and out. Sometimes it seemed like we'd lost them, only for a howl to pierce the night air, far too close for comfort. Finally, we had to stop. The kids were exhausted, and even Sarah, and now we're struggling to catch our breath. We found a small clearing just off the trail, bordered on one side by a steep rocky slope. Up there, I panted, pointing to a narrow ledge about halfway up the slope. We'll have a better view, and they might have a harder time reaching us. It was a tough climb, especially for the kids, but fear is a powerful motivator. We helped each other up loose rocks, skittering down the slope. As we scrambled for handholds from our perch on the ledge, we could see a good portion of the surrounding forest. The eastern sky was just starting to lighten. With the first hints of dawn, we've been running for longer than I'd thought. What were those things? Ethan asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head. I don't know, buddy. I've never seen anything like them. They looked like wolves, Lily chimed in, but bigger and scary. Sarah pulled the kids close, trying to comfort them. I kept my eyes on the forest below, watching for any sign of movement. How much further to the ranger station? I asked Sarah. She consulted the map, using the flashlight sparingly to preserve the batteries. Maybe another 2 miles. It's hard to tell exactly where we are. I nodded, trying to formulate a plan. We were all exhausted, but we couldn't stay on this ledge forever. Those creatures were still out there, and they didn't seem like the type to give up easily. As if in response to my thoughts, a howl echoed through the trees. It was answered by another, then another. They were regrouping, coordinating. The sound sent shivers down my spine. We need to move, I said. They're getting closer. We climbed down from the ledge as quietly as we could, every snapping twig and rolling pebble sounding impossibly loud in the pre-dawn stillness. As soon as we reached the bottom, we heard it, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, heading our way. Fast run, I shouted for the second time. That night we took off down the trail, fear lending us speed we didn't know we possessed. I could hear the creatures behind us, they breathing heavy, their paws pounding the earth. Suddenly Lily screamed. I turned to see one of the creatures lunging for her. Without thinking, I swung the hatchet with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and the creature fell back with a yelp. For the first time, I got a clear look at what was chasing us. It was wolf-like in shape, but much larger, easily the size of a bear. Its fur was patchy and mangy, and its eyes glowed that unnatural green I'd seen earlier. But most disturbingly, its face seemed almost human-like in its intelligence and cruelty. The creature I'd hit was already struggling to its feet. 2 more emerged from the trees, stalking towards us with predatory grace. Go, I yelled to Sarah. And the kids, I'll hold them off. No, Sarah cried, but she knew as well as I did that this was our only chance. She grabbed the kids' hands and ran. Ethan looking back over his shoulder with tears in his eyes. I faced the creature's hatchet raised, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. They circled me slowly, obviously intelligent enough to be cautious after seeing what I'd done to their packmate. Just as I thought they were about to pounce, a new sound cut through the air. A helicopter. The creature's head snapped up, their ears twitching. The sound grew louder, and suddenly the forest was illuminated by a powerful searchlight. The creature snarled in frustration, but began to back away. As the helicopter drew closer, they turned and looped off into the darkness. I stood there, hatchet still raised, hardly daring to believe it was over. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Sarah calling my name. She ran towards me, the kids close behind. As forest rangers repelled from the helicopter, the next few hours were a blur of questions, medical checks, and trying to explain what we'd seen to increasingly skeptical rangers. They found large tracks, and some for samples, but no sign of the creatures themselves. We later learned that there had been other reports of strange animal attacks in the area, but nothing concrete. Some blamed it on a pack of unusually aggressive wolves, others on escaped exotic pets. There were even whispers of genetic experiments gone wrong. As for us, we never went camping again. The kids developed a fear of the dark that took years of therapy to overcome. Sarah and I had our own nightmares to contend with. but we were alive, and we were together. And every time I look at my family, I'm reminded of how close we came to losing everything that night. In the forest, it taught me that the world is full of mysteries and dangers we can't explain, and that when faced with the unimaginable, the strength of family can make all the difference between survival and becoming just another unexplained. Like and subscribe for 4.